The morning sun cast long shadows across the shooting range at Naval Base Coronado. The distinctive crack of high-caliber rifles echoed through the air as SEAL Team 8 ran through their qualification drills. Commander Jack "Iron" Reynolds watched his men with a critical eye, noting every minor deviation in their form and execution. "Thompson, adjust your breathing pattern. You're jerking the trigger between exhales," Reynolds called out, his weathered face showing little emotion beneath his salt and pepper beard. At 42, Reynolds was considered one of the most experienced SEAL team leaders still in active field service. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless classified operations had earned him a reputation as a no-nonsense commander who demanded perfection. "Yes, sir," Bill "Doc" Thompson replied, readjusting his position behind the M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle. At 34, Thompson was the team's primary marksman with an impressive service record of his own. Still, even he knew better than to question Reynolds's observations. Meanwhile, at the far end of the range, a slender figure moved quietly among the equipment sheds. Sarah Miller, 26, had been the range maintenance specialist at Coronado for just over 2 years. Her duties were straightforward: clean the shooting stations, replace targets, collect spent brass casings, and ensure all equipment was properly maintained for the elite warriors who trained there daily. To the men of SEAL Team 8, Sarah was practically invisible, just another civilian contractor who kept the machinery of the naval base running smoothly. Few of them had ever spoken more than a few words to her beyond basic courtesies, and fewer still knew anything about her background or qualifications. Sarah preferred it that way. As she methodically collected brass casings from an adjacent lane, she glanced briefly at Thompson's shooting form. Her trained eye noticed immediately what Reynolds had pointed out: the subtle inconsistency in Thompson's breathing pattern that was affecting his accuracy at long range. But she also caught something Reynolds hadn't mentioned. Thompson's left elbow was positioned at an angle that created unnecessary tension in his shoulder. "That's going to cause drift after his 4th or 5th shot in rapid sequence," she thought to herself, but kept her expression neutral as she continued her work. Sarah had learned long ago that offering unsolicited advice to men like these was rarely welcomed, especially from someone they viewed as merely the cleaning girl. So she moved silently through her morning routine, all while absorbing every detail of the SEAL team's training exercises like a sponge. "Miller!" a voice called out, breaking her concentration. Sarah looked up to see Chief Petty Officer Mike Harris, the team's communications specialist, gesturing toward a cluster of targets at the 300-meter mark. "We need those targets replaced before we move to the next drill." "Right away, sir," she replied, her voice quiet but clear. Harris barely acknowledged her response before turning back to his team. That was typical of the interactions Sarah had with the operators, brief, professional, and utterly forgettable from their perspective. As she loaded fresh targets onto her maintenance cart, Sarah's mind drifted back to her childhood in Montana, to the sprawling ranch where she had spent every weekend of her youth learning skills that the men on this range would never suspect she possessed. "Breathe, little ghost. Breathe and be still." 11-year-old Sarah Miller lay prone on the frost-covered grass of her grandfather's ranch. A modified Remington 700 bolt-action rifle, customized with a shorter stock to fit her small frame, pressed against her shoulder. The crisp Montana morning air filled her lungs as she followed the familiar rhythm her grandfather had taught her. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale for 4, hold for 2. Beside her, James "Ghost Eye" Miller watched through a spotting scope, his weathered hands steady despite the early morning chill. At 67, the former Army Ranger still carried himself with the quiet dignity and precision that had made him a legend among a very select group of military operators decades earlier. "What's the distance to target?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. Sarah squinted slightly through the scope. 425 yards to the center of the steel plate. Wind. She licked her finger and held it up briefly before returning to her shooting position. Approximately 6 miles per hour left to right. Temperature effect. Cold morning, approximately 42 degrees. Density altitude is higher than standard. Bullet will impact slightly higher than at standard conditions. James nodded approvingly. And what does that tell you about your adjustment? Sarah's small fingers made minute adjustments to her scope. I need to compensate 1.5 minutes right for wind drift and adjust down a quarter minute for density altitude. Good. James smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. Now remember what I always tell you. The rifle is just a tool. Sarah recited, her eyes never leaving the scope. My mind is the real weapon. That's my girl. When you're ready, take your shot. Sarah cycled through her breathing pattern once more, feeling her heartbeat slow as she entered the state of calm focus her grandfather had spent years helping her develop. The world narrowed to just her, the rifle, and the distant steel plate. On her final exhale, she squeezed the trigger with deliberate pressure. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the report echoing across the open Montana landscape. A moment later, the clear ring of a bullet striking steel reached their ears. Center hit, James announced proudly. Excellent shot, little ghost. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. Again, James chuckled. You never get tired of this, do you? Never, she replied earnestly. I want to be as good as you were, Grandpa. A shadow crossed the old man's face, but it passed quickly. You'll be better, Sarah. Much better. The world just needs to catch up to what women like you can do. And as they continued their practice, James Miller shared stories of his time in service, carefully edited versions of classified operations that had taken him from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of the Middle East. What he never told her directly, but what Sarah had pieced together from overheard conversations and old photographs hidden in his study, was that her grandfather had once been among the most lethal precision marksmen in U.S. military history. Master Sergeant James "Ghost Eye" Miller had served with the 75th Ranger Regiment during some of the most sensitive operations of the Cold War and beyond. His confirmed kills during official operations exceeded 100, though the actual number was likely much higher. More importantly, he had pioneered shooting techniques and fieldcraft methods that were still being taught in modified form to special operations snipers today. "Grandpa," Sarah asked, as they packed up their gear later that morning, "why did you leave the Army? Mom says you could have been a general if you'd stayed in." James secured the rifle case before answering. "Your mother exaggerates. Rangers don't typically become generals." He paused, considering how much to share with his precocious granddaughter. "I was injured during an operation in Lebanon in '83, rocket attack, shrapnel in my right arm and shoulder." He flexed his right hand unconsciously, the old scars barely visible now. "The damage wasn't career-ending physically, but the mission itself. There were complications, political considerations. The operation was disavowed." "What does disavowed mean?" Sarah asked, struggling with the unfamiliar word. "It means the government decided officially that we were never there, that what we did, what we sacrificed, never happened." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable even to a child. "I couldn't serve under those conditions anymore, not when good men died for nothing." Sarah nodded solemnly, sensing the weight of her grandfather's words, even if she couldn't fully comprehend them yet. "Is that why you started teaching me? Because no one remembered what you did?" James smiled, then a genuine smile that softened his normally stern features. "No, little ghost. I teach you because you have a gift, a natural talent that shouldn't be wasted just because you were born a girl in a world that doesn't yet understand what women are capable of. He knelt down to her level, his hands on her shoulders. I teach you because someday the skills I'm giving you might make all the difference, not just for you, but for others who might need you. It was a prophecy that would prove more accurate than either of them could have imagined. Sarah's small apartment in the suburbs of San Diego was sparse, but meticulously organized. The living room contained a comfortable but unremarkable sofa, a coffee table stacked with ballistics journals and engineering magazines, and a television that rarely saw use. The kitchen was equally utilitarian, with a single place setting that spoke to her solitary lifestyle. The bedroom, however, told a different story. After securing her apartment door behind her, Sarah moved to the bedroom closet and knelt on the hardwood floor. She slid aside a section of baseboard to reveal a small hidden compartment containing a combination safe. After entering the code, her grandfather's date of birth, she removed a weathered wooden box with "Rangers Lead the Way" carved into the lid. Inside the box lay the tangible remnants of James Miller's military legacy, his Silver Star Medal awarded for valor during a classified operation, his Master Sergeant insignia, a faded photograph of a young James standing with his Ranger team in the early 1970s, and a small leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes on advanced shooting techniques, environmental calculations, and observations from decades of precision marksmanship. Sarah ran her fingers lightly over the silver star. Her grandfather had rarely spoken about how he earned it, saying only that it came at too high a price. After his death 5 years earlier, she had found documents in his personal effects, suggesting the medal was connected to a covert operation codenamed Eagle Falls, an apparent offshoot of the infamous Operation Eagle Claw, the failed 1980 attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran. According to the fragmentary information Sarah had pieced together, her grandfather had been part of a secondary team assigned to eliminate security threats around the primary extraction zone. When the main operation was aborted after helicopter failures, James's team was allegedly left in position for an additional 36 hours, continuing their mission without support or acknowledgement. What happened during those 36 hours remained a mystery even to Sarah. Her grandfather had taken those secrets to his grave, leaving behind only cryptic journal entries and redacted documents that raised more questions than they answered. Sarah replaced the journal in the box, her mind turning to the day's events at the shooting range. Watching SEAL Team 8 train, observing their techniques and procedures, always brought a mix of emotions: professional interest, certainly, but also a deep-seated frustration that her own skills remained unrecognized and unutilized. After her grandfather's death, Sarah had attempted to enlist in the military with hopes of eventually qualifying for sniper training. Her test scores had been exemplary perfect marks on the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, outstanding physical fitness assessments, and preliminary marksmanship evaluations that had raised eyebrows among the recruiting officers. But bureaucratic obstacles and institutional biases had proven insurmountable. Despite her qualifications, she had been steered toward support roles rather than combat specialties. The message, though never stated explicitly, had been clear: women, regardless of their abilities, were not welcome in the rarefied world of special operations and precision marksmanship. Rather than accept a role that would waste her unique training, Sarah had instead pursued a degree in mechanical engineering with a focus on ballistics, hoping that academic credentials might open doors that her gender had closed. Upon graduation, she had taken the maintenance position at Coronado, reasoning that proximity to the training environment of elite operators would provide opportunities that might not otherwise be available. For 2 years, she had watched and waited, absorbing everything she could about current tactics, techniques, and procedures, while remaining essentially invisible to the men who employed them. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her grandfather had been nicknamed Ghost Eye for his ability to observe targets undetected for days at a time. And now she had become a different kind of ghost, hidden in plain sight among the very warriors who might have benefited from her skills. Her phone buzzed with a text message alert. It was from her supervisor at the base. "Need you in early tomorrow. 0500. SEAL Team 8 scheduled for pre-deployment qualification shoot. Full range setup required." Sarah texted back a simple acknowledgement. Pre-deployment qualification meant that Reynolds' team was preparing for an imminent mission, likely somewhere in the Middle East given the current geopolitical situation. It also meant they would be utilizing the full range complex, including the advanced 1,000-yard course that was reserved for final validation of mission-ready teams. She would need to be at her best tomorrow, ensuring that every aspect of the range was perfectly prepared for what might be the team's final training evolution before deploying into harm's way. What she could never have anticipated was that tomorrow would also bring a reckoning that would forever change how the men of SEAL Team 8 and the entire Naval Special Warfare community viewed the quiet woman who maintained their ranges. The naval base was eerily quiet, as Sarah's ID badge granted her access through the security checkpoint. The sky was still dark, with only the faintest hint of approaching dawn on the eastern horizon. She drove her maintenance truck to the range complex, the familiar routine requiring little conscious thought. As she began setting up the range, placing target arrays at various distances, and ensuring the electronic scoring systems were properly calibrated, Sarah's mind wandered to the dream that had disturbed her sleep the previous night. A vivid reimagining of one of her grandfather's rare stories about his time in Lebanon. In the dream, as in her grandfather's telling, James Miller had been positioned on a rooftop overlooking a market square, tasked with eliminating a high-value target associated with the terrorist bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks. But in Sarah's dream, as the moment of the shot approached, she had found herself behind the rifle instead of her grandfather, the crosshairs centered on a figure whose face remained obscured. She had awakened just as her dream self squeezed the trigger, the phantom recoil of the rifle still reverberating through her body as consciousness returned. "Unusual to see someone who enjoys 0500 range setup," a voice commented, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. She turned to find Commander Reynolds standing nearby, his arms crossed, as he surveyed the work she had already completed. Despite the early hour, he was fully outfitted in his combat uniform, his bearing as precise as if he were about to address a formation. "Good morning, Commander," Sarah replied professionally. "Just getting everything ready for your team's qualification." Reynolds nodded, his expression unreadable. "You've been maintaining our ranges for 2 years now?" "Yes, sir. 2 years and 3 months. "You do good work, Miller. Ranges are always in perfect condition when my team arrives." It was the closest thing to a compliment Sarah had ever received from the SEAL commander. "Thank you, sir. I try to ensure everything is operational and accurate." Reynolds seemed about to say something else when his radio crackled to life. "Commander Thompson and Harris have arrived with the equipment truck. Ready to begin setup whenever you are." "Copy that. On my way." Reynolds gave Sarah a final nod before striding toward the main range building. The brief interaction left Sarah with an odd feeling. In 2 years, Reynolds had hardly acknowledged her existence beyond basic professional courtesy, and now he had sought her out specifically to comment on her work. It was unusual, but she had little time to dwell on it as the rest of SEAL Team 8 began arriving for their qualification shoot. As the morning progressed, Sarah remained in the background, making adjustments to targets when requested and ensuring the range equipment functioned flawlessly. She watched as the team cycled through various weapon systems and distances, noting the subtle differences in each operator's technique and effectiveness. Thompson, the team's primary marksman, was performing well at ranges up to 800 yards, but Sarah could see that he was struggling with the extreme long-distance shots at the 1,000-yard line. His fundamentals were solid, but something in his application was inconsistent at the outer limits of conventional marksmanship. "Thompson, you're dropping your shots at the 7 o'clock position consistently," Reynolds observed after reviewing the target camera feed. "Adjust your windage and try again." Sarah, who had been collecting spent casings nearby, could see that Reynolds's diagnosis was incorrect. The pattern of Thompson's shots suggested not a windage issue, but a subtle flaw in his shooting position, one that her grandfather had specifically trained her to recognize and correct. For a moment, she considered saying nothing. It wasn't her place to contradict a SEAL commander or offer advice to his team. But as Thompson prepared to fire another sequence, frustration evident in his body language, Sarah made a decision that would alter the course of her life. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly, approaching Reynolds with appropriate deference. "I don't mean to intrude, but I noticed something that might help." Reynolds turned surprise evident on his face. "What's that, Miller?" "It's not a windage issue, sir. Petty Officer Thompson's left elbow is positioning too far under the rifle, creating torque in his shoulder. That's why the shots are grouping at 7 o'clock at extended ranges. The muscular tension increases as he fatigues through each string of fire." The range fell silent. Thompson had paused in his preparation, looking over his shoulder at the civilian maintenance specialist who had just delivered a technical assessment of his shooting form. Reynolds' expression darkened. "And you know this, how exactly?" Sarah hesitated suddenly, aware of the attention focused on her. "I observe a lot of shooting on these ranges, sir. You start to notice patterns." For a tense moment, Reynolds said nothing, his eyes evaluating Sarah with new interest. Then he turned to Thompson. "Adjust your support elbow position, Doc. Let's see if Miller's observation has merit." Thompson, clearly skeptical, nevertheless, made the suggested adjustment. His next 5-shot group at the 1,000-yard target showed immediate improvement, the rounds impacting much closer to center mass. "Well, I'll be damned," Thompson muttered, reviewing the target camera feed. He glanced back at Sarah with newfound respect. "Good eye." Reynolds studied the target results, then turned to Sarah. "Where did you learn to diagnose shooting form like that, Miller? That's not something you pick up just by watching." Before Sarah could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much of her background, Chief Petty Officer Harris jogged up to the firing line. "Commander Base Security is reporting unusual activity along the perimeter near the Eastern Access Road. Multiple unidentified individuals observed approaching the fence line." Reynolds immediately shifted into command mode. "Get the team ready. Full kit live ammunition. This could be nothing but given the current threat assessment." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone present was aware that naval installations had been placed on elevated alert status following intelligence reports of potential terrorist reconnaissance activities. What had initially been dismissed as isolated incidents had recently been reassessed as possible indicators of a coordinated surveillance effort targeting military training facilities. "Miller," Reynolds addressed Sarah, "secure the range equipment and then find shelter in the main building until we determine what's happening." "Yes, sir," she replied, already moving to collect the sensitive electronic equipment. As SEAL Team 8 rapidly prepared for a potential security threat, Sarah worked efficiently to secure the range. Years of practice with her grandfather had instilled in her the importance of proper equipment care, even or especially during emergency situations. She was securing the last of the spotting scopes when the first explosion rocked the training complex. The initial blast came from the direction of the base's main administrative building, a thunderous detonation that sent a visible shockwave across the open ground of the range complex. Black smoke billowed skyward, as secondary explosions followed in rapid succession. "Contact! Contact!" Harris shouted into his radio. "Multiple explosions at the admin building. Request immediate." His transmission was cut short as a barrage of small arms fire erupted from the tree line bordering the eastern edge of the range. Bullets impacted the concrete barriers and kicked up dust from the ground around the SEAL team's position. "Take cover," Reynolds commanded, his voice carrying above the chaos. "Return fire. Establish security perimeter." The team reacted with the precision expected of elite operators, taking defensive positions and returning coordinated fire toward the sources of the attack. But it quickly became apparent that they were facing a well-organized adversary who had carefully planned their assault. We've got shooters on the northern ridge as well," Thompson reported, indicating the elevated terrain that overlooked the range complex. "Looks like they've established interlocking fields of fire. We're pinned down." Reynolds keyed his radio. "Base Command, this is SEAL Team 8 Actual. We are under attack at the Eastern Range Complex. Multiple hostiles coordinated fire requesting immediate QRF response." The radio crackled with static before a response came through. "SEAL Team 8, this is Base Command. Confirmed attacks at multiple locations across the installation. Security forces engaged at main gate and administrative complex. QRF is mobilizing, but ETA to your position is approximately 15 minutes. Can you hold?" Reynolds surveyed their situation grimly. His team had taken cover behind concrete shooting barriers and equipment sheds, but their position offered limited protection against the elevated firing positions the attackers had secured. Already, 2 of his men had sustained injuries. Petty Officer Jackson had taken a round through his upper arm, and Petty Officer Martinez had caught shrapnel from a near miss that had fragmented against concrete. "We'll hold as long as we can," Reynolds replied. "But be advised, enemy has fire superiority from elevated positions. We are effectively pinned down." As the firefight intensified, Sarah Miller had taken cover behind the range maintenance building, her heart pounding, but her mind surprisingly clear. The situation was dire. The SEAL team was outnumbered and outpositioned with limited ammunition and dwindling options for movement or counterattack. From her position, Sarah could see what the others couldn't: a third group of attackers moving through a drainage culvert that would bring them behind the SEAL team's defensive perimeter within minutes. If they succeeded, Reynolds and his men would be caught in a devastating crossfire with no viable escape route. Sarah made a rapid assessment of her available resources. The range maintenance building contained various tools and equipment, but nothing that would conventionally be considered a weapon. However, in the adjacent small arms locker used for storing demonstration weapons for training purposes, she knew there was at least one functional rifle, a modified M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle that had been prepared for a marksmanship demonstration scheduled for later in the week. Making her decision, Sarah moved quickly to the arms locker. Using her maintenance keys, she accessed the secure storage area and located the M110 rifle case. Inside, as expected, was the weapon along with 2 magazines loaded with 7.62mm ammunition. The rifle was similar to models she had trained with extensively on her grandfather's ranch, a civilian variant of the same platform modified for competition shooting. The fundamental operation was identical, though this military version featured additional tactical accessories, including a suppressor and enhanced optics. Sarah quickly inspected the weapon, cycling the action to ensure it was functioning properly and confirming that the optics were at least approximately zeroed for mid-range engagement distances. It wasn't ideal. In a perfect world, she would have verified the exact zero for the specific ammunition load, but it would have to suffice under the circumstances. Slinging the rifle across her back, Sarah moved to a position where she could observe the drainage culvert without exposing herself to the existing fields of fire. From there, she could see three armed men advancing cautiously toward the rear of the SEAL team's position. They were approximately 300 yards away, a challenging shot under stress conditions, but well within the capabilities of both the rifle and a shooter of Sarah's caliber. She settled into a stable shooting position using a maintenance equipment crate as an improvised rest. The familiar ritual of preparation flowed through her body. Automatically, check natural point of aim, establish proper cheek weld, regulate breathing, identify target, calculate basic ballistic factors. Wind is negligible at this distance. Target moving slowly, right to left. Lead approximately 1/2 body width. No significant elevation change to account for. Sarah centered the crosshairs on the lead attacker, controlled her breathing, as her grandfather had taught her, and pressed the trigger with deliberate precision. The rifle's report was partially muffled by the suppressor barely audible above the ongoing gunfire. Through the scope, Sarah saw the lead attacker drop immediately, the round finding its mark, center mass. The two remaining hostiles reacted with confusion, unable to identify the source of fire that had struck down their comrade. Before they could orient themselves or seek cover, Sarah had cycled through her shooting sequence twice more. 2 more precision shots, 2 more hostiles neutralized. The entire engagement had taken less than 15 seconds. Without pausing to reflect on what she had just done, Sarah shifted her attention to the northern ridge where the attackers maintaining fire superiority over the SEAL team were positioned. The distance was greater, approximately 600 yards, and the elevated position created a more challenging shooting solution. Uphill shot. Need to adjust for cosine angle. Approximately 15-degree incline means impact will be slightly high if I don't compensate. Wind from the west at roughly 8 mph, requiring right-to-left drift compensation. Sarah made the necessary adjustments to the rifle's optic, then began systematically engaging the hostile positions on the ridge. Each shot was carefully calculated, her movements economical and precise. One by one, the enemy firing positions fell silent as her rounds found their targets. From their defensive position, Reynolds and his team noticed the change in the tactical situation. The incoming fire from the ridge had diminished significantly, though they couldn't identify why. "Someone's engaging the hostiles on the ridge," Thompson observed, peering through a gap in the concrete barrier. "Precision fire, taking them out one by one." "Must be advance elements of the QRF," Reynolds suggested, though he sounded uncertain. The shooting was too methodical, too precise to match the typical response of a quick reaction force. It was Harris who first spotted Sarah as she repositioned to engage the remaining threats on the eastern perimeter. "Sir, is that Miller?" Reynolds followed Harris's line of sight, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief as he recognized the range maintenance specialist now moving with tactical precision between cover positions, the M110 rifle held with obvious familiarity as she continued to systematically eliminate the attacking force. "What the hell?" Thompson muttered, articulating the thought shared by every member of the team. Before Reynolds could formulate a response or take action, his radio crackled again. "SEAL Team 8, this is Base Command. Be advised, security camera footage shows hostiles have breached the weapons storage facility. Intelligence suggests they may be attempting to access classified materials stored in the secure data center adjacent to the armory." The secure data center. Reynolds felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ongoing firefight. That facility contained some of the most sensitive operational information on the base, including mission files, personnel records, and details of forthcoming deployments. If the attackers gained access to those systems, the damage to national security could be incalculable. "Acknowledged Base Command. We will attempt to reinforce the data center, but we are still under heavy fire. ETA on that QRF." QRF is engaged at the main gate. Estimate another 10 minutes before they can reach your position. 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours. If the attackers were already inside the weapons storage facility, they would reach the adjacent data center within minutes. Reynolds made a rapid tactical assessment. His team was pinned down, outgunned, and at least partially compromised by injuries. Moving to reinforce the data center would require crossing 200 meters of open ground under potential enemy fire. The risk was extreme. And then there was Miller, the civilian maintenance specialist, who was somehow single-handedly turning the tide of the firefight with shooting skills that rivaled or exceeded those of his most qualified operators. Making his decision, Reynolds keyed his radio. "Miller, this is Commander Reynolds. If you can hear me, acknowledge." After a brief pause, Sarah's voice came through the channel. "This is Miller. Go ahead, Commander. What's your situation? Can you provide covering fire for my team to maneuver?" "Affirmative, sir. I've neutralized the northern ridge position and 3 hostiles attempting to flank your rear. Eastern perimeter still active, approximately 4 to 5 shooters remaining. I have visual and can suppress." Reynolds exchanged disbelieving glances with Thompson and Harris. The calm professionalism in Miller's voice was completely at odds with her supposed role as a civilian range technician. "Copy that. On my signal, provide suppressing fire on the eastern perimeter. Team will bound toward the weapons facility to secure the data center." "Understood. Ready on your mark," Sarah replied, already adjusting her position to better cover the team's movement. Reynolds gathered his operators. "On my signal, we move in 2 elements. Harris, you take Jackson and Lewis. I'll take Thompson and Martinez. Tactical advance to the weapons facility. Miller will provide cover." The team acknowledged their orders, though their expressions still registered shock at the unexpected development of their range maintenance specialist providing tactical support. "Execute in 3, 2, 1 mark." Reynolds gave the command. Sarah opened fire on the eastern perimeter, her shots precisely targeted to suppress the remaining hostiles without necessarily eliminating them, a different tactical application of marksmanship that prioritized volume and coverage over individual kills. Under her covering fire, SEAL Team 8 began their advance across the open ground, moving in coordinated bounds, as they had trained countless times. Reynolds led his element forward, experiencing the surreal sensation of being protected by civilian maintenance personnel rather than dedicated military support. The team had covered approximately half the distance to the weapons facility when a new threat emerged. A hostile armed with what appeared to be a light machine gun appeared on the roof of an adjacent building, positioning to enfilade the advancing SEALs. Reynolds spotted the threat too late to redirect his team. "Machine gun, high right," and he shouted, already calculating that they would be caught in the open before they could reach cover. The machine gunner began to bring his weapon to bear and then jerked backward, his weapon clattering unfired to the rooftop as he collapsed. Through his peripheral vision, Reynolds caught the muzzle flash from Sarah's position over 700 yards from the rooftop target she had just neutralized with a single shot. The remainder of the advance proceeded without further incident, the team reaching the weapons facility entrance within minutes. The door showed signs of forced entry, confirming that hostiles had indeed breached the building. "Miller, what's your visual on the facility?" Reynolds radioed. "I can observe the main entrance and east-facing windows," Sarah replied. "No movement visible from my position, but limited line of sight to interior." "Copy that. Maintain overwatch while we clear the building." With practiced efficiency, the SEAL team prepared to enter the facility. Reynolds took point with Thompson, covering their 6, as they moved through the breached entrance and began clearing the structure room by room. Evidence of the hostile presence was immediately apparent. 2 security personnel were down in the entry vestibule, and shell casings littered the floor, indicating a brief but intense firefight. Moving deeper into the facility, they encountered 3 dead hostiles, apparently taken out by the security team before being overwhelmed. As they approached the data center entrance, Reynolds detected voices from within, at least 2 individuals speaking in hushed tones. The language wasn't immediately recognizable, but the urgency in their voices suggested they were working against time. Reynolds signaled his team to prepare for breach entry. On his mark, Thompson kicked in the door, while Harris tossed a flashbang grenade into the room. The disorienting explosion was followed immediately by the team's entry weapons raised and ready to engage. Inside, they found 3 hostiles, 2 still disoriented from the flashbang, while a third was already recovering, raising his weapon toward the entering SEALs. Reynolds neutralized the immediate threat with 2 center-mass shots before the team secured the remaining hostiles. A quick assessment confirmed the data center's primary systems appeared intact, though one of the hostiles had been attempting to connect an external device to the main server, likely to download classified information. Base Command, this is SEAL Team 8 Actual. Data center secure. 3 hostiles neutralized server systems appear intact. Request technical team to verify no data compromise. Copy that, SEAL Team 8. Technical response team en route. QRF has secured the main gate and is proceeding to your location to establish perimeter security. With the immediate crisis contained, Reynolds found his thoughts returning to the unexpected intervention that had potentially saved his entire team and prevented a catastrophic security breach. Harris maintained security here. Thompson with me. Reynolds headed back outside, intent on finding the woman who had demonstrated capabilities that no range maintenance specialist should possess. They found Sarah near the original range position, methodically clearing the M110 rifle and returning it to its case. Her movements were precise and practiced the kind of weapons handling that came only from years of experience. As Reynolds approached, Sarah straightened her expression, composed but wary. "Sir," she acknowledged, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline that must have been coursing through her system after the intense firefight. Reynolds studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Miller, I think you owe us an explanation." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir, I suppose I do. Where did you learn to shoot like that? That wasn't just good marksmanship, that was expert-level precision under combat conditions, the kind of skill that takes years of specialized training to develop." Sarah hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she reached into her pocket and removed a worn photograph, handing it to Reynolds. The photograph showed a younger version of Sarah standing beside an older man in civilian clothes, both holding precision rifles on what appeared to be a private shooting range. The man's bearing was unmistakably military despite the civilian attire. "My grandfather," Sarah explained, "Master Sergeant James Ghost Eye Miller, Army Rangers. He served from 1968 to 1983, including operations in Vietnam, Central America, and the Middle East." Reynolds' eyes widened in recognition. Ghost Eye Miller, the sniper from Operation Eagle Claw. Sarah nodded, surprised that Reynolds knew the reference. "You've heard of him. Every serious student of Special Operations history knows that name," Reynolds replied. "He was credited with over 100 confirmed kills during sanctioned operations and rumored to have developed advanced marksmanship techniques still taught in modified form today." He looked at Sarah with new understanding. "He was your grandfather?" "Yes, sir. He raised me after my parents divorced, taught me everything he knew about precision shooting, fieldcraft, and tactical assessment. Every weekend from the time I was 8 years old until I left for college." Thompson, who had been listening to the exchange, interjected. "Why are you working maintenance at a SEAL training facility instead of putting those skills to use? With that kind of training and obvious natural ability?" Sarah's expression hardened slightly. I tried, Petty Officer Thompson. Perfect scores on every marksmanship evaluation during recruitment. Top percentile in physical fitness assessments. But when it came to placement in advanced training programs, she shrugged. Let's just say the doors to certain specialties remain difficult for women to open regardless of qualification. Reynolds absorbed this information, his tactical mind reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman who had maintained their ranges for over 2 years. The implications were profound, not just for his understanding of Sarah Miller, but for the broader question of how the military identified and utilized talent. Before he could respond, his radio activated again. "Commander Reynolds, this is Captain Westfield. Report to the command center immediately. We have a situation developing that requires your attention." "Acknowledged. On my way." Reynolds turned back to Sarah. "This conversation isn't over, Miller. Stay available." As Reynolds departed with Thompson, Sarah remained by the range equipment, the adrenaline of combat finally beginning to ebb from her system. For 2 years, she had maintained her cover as just another civilian contractor, invisible to the operators who trained on her ranges. Now, in the space of 30 minutes, everything had changed. What she couldn't know was that the morning's events were merely the opening move in a much larger and more dangerous game, one that would force her to confront not only institutional barriers, but also buried secrets from her grandfather's past that had never been meant to see the light of day. The base command center was a hive of controlled chaos when Reynolds arrived. Multiple screens displayed security camera feeds from across the installation, while communications personnel coordinated response efforts with various units and agencies. Captain Thomas Westfield, the base commander, stood at the central tactical table, his expression grave as he examined a digital map of the facility with key areas highlighted in red. "Commander Reynolds, join us." Westfield gestured Reynolds forward. "What's your assessment of the attack on the data center?" Reynolds provided a concise briefing on the tactical situation his team had encountered, including the neutralization of the hostile force and the securing of the data systems. He deliberately omitted any mention of Sarah Miller's involvement, preferring to address that situation separately after he had more information. "The attack was coordinated and well-planned," Reynolds concluded. "These weren't common terrorists or opportunistic criminals. Their tactics equipment and target selection all suggest advanced training and specific intelligence about the base layout and security protocols." Westfield nodded grimly. "That aligns with our preliminary analysis. FBI counterterrorism is already en route, but initial indications suggest this wasn't an ideologically motivated attack. This was a targeted operation with specific objectives." He gestured to one of the intelligence officers. "Lieutenant Chen, brief Commander Reynolds on what we've found." Lieutenant Chen stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Sir, we've completed initial identification of the neutralized hostiles. They're not affiliated with any known terrorist organization. In fact, several have backgrounds in private military contracting with employment histories linked to Black River Security Group." "Black River," Reynolds frowned. "That's a legitimate PMC with government contracts. Why would their people be attacking a U.S. naval installation?" "That's the question, sir," Chen replied. "Even more concerning is what we found on one of the hostiles attempting to access the data center." She handed Reynolds a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be a military identification card. The card showed signs of age, with a photograph of a man in his 30s wearing an army dress uniform. "This appears to be an authentic military ID from the early 1980s, Chen explained. "The name on the ID is Frank Wilson, former U.S. Army Captain Special Forces. According to our records, Captain Wilson and his entire team were killed during an operation in Somalia in 1993. Reynolds stared at the ID, a cold sensation spreading through his chest. Clearly, the reports of his death were exaggerated. "That's not all, sir," Chen continued. "When we began searching our databases for any reference to Captain Wilson, we found something unusual. His service record has been heavily redacted with entire operations completely blacked out. But one name appeared in connection with his final mission in Somalia, a mission that officially never happened." "What name?" Reynolds asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Master Sergeant James Miller, code name Ghost Eye." According to fragmentary records, Miller was somehow connected to the Somalia operation, though the exact nature of his involvement is unclear due to redactions. Reynolds's mind raced as he processed this information. James Miller, the grandfather of the civilian range technician who had demonstrated extraordinary combat capabilities just hours earlier. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. Captain Reynolds addressed Westfield directly. "There's something you need to know about the attack on the range complex." For the next several minutes, Reynolds briefed the command staff on Sarah Miller's unexpected intervention during the firefight, including her exceptional marksmanship and apparent tactical training. He concluded by revealing her relationship to James Miller and the implications of that connection given what they now knew about the attacking force. Westfield listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly concerned. When Reynolds finished, the captain was silent for a long moment before responding. "Let me understand this correctly," Westfield said finally. "A civilian range maintenance specialist with no official military training single-handedly neutralized multiple hostile threats, potentially saving your entire team. And she happens to be the granddaughter of a legendary special operations sniper who may be connected to a decades-old mission involving one of our attackers who was presumed dead." "That summarizes it, yes, sir," Reynolds confirmed. Westfield exchanged glances with his intelligence staff. "This is no longer just a security breach. We may be dealing with the resurfacing of a classified operation with significant national security implications." He turned to Lieutenant Chen. "I want Sarah Miller brought to the command center immediately for questioning." "See," Reynolds interjected, "with respect, Miller just saved my team and potentially prevented a catastrophic breach of classified information. I'd suggest approaching her as a potential asset rather than a suspect." Westfield considered this. "Fair point, Commander. But we need to understand exactly who she is and what she knows about her grandfather's operations, particularly any connection to this Frank Wilson and the Somalia mission." "I'll bring her in myself," Reynolds offered. "She's more likely to cooperate if approached by someone she's at least familiar with." "Very well," Westfield agreed. "But make it clear this is not optional. We need to debrief her immediately." As Reynolds left the command center, his mind was filled with questions. Who was Sarah Miller really? How much did she know about her grandfather's classified operations? And most importantly, what was the connection between James "Ghost Eye" Miller, the supposedly deceased Captain Frank Wilson, and the coordinated attack on Naval Base Coronado? Whatever the answers, Reynolds had a growing sense that the morning's events were merely the visible portion of a much larger and more dangerous situation, one that had been hidden for decades and was now emerging into the light with potentially devastating consequences. Sarah sat alone in the small office of the range maintenance building, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The adrenaline of combat had fully subsided, leaving her with the hollow, drained feeling that followed intense stress, a sensation her grandfather had warned her about, but that she had never truly experienced until today. She had spent the past hour attempting to process the implications of her actions during the attack. For 2 years, she had maintained her cover as just another civilian contractor, hiding her specialized training and unique skills. Now, in the space of 30 minutes, she had revealed capabilities that would inevitably raise questions she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. The door opened and Commander Reynolds entered, his expression unreadable. Sarah straightened in her chair instinctively, adopting the respectful posture that military dependents often learned through osmosis. "Miller," Reynolds acknowledged, taking the seat across from her. "How are you holding up?" The question surprised her, not what she had expected from a SEAL commander who had just discovered one of his civilian staff members possessed combat skills that rivaled those of his operators. "I'm fine, sir," she replied automatically. Reynolds studied her with experienced eyes. "No, you're not. You just engaged in your first actual combat situation, took lives, made split-second decisions under fire. That affects everyone, regardless of training." Sarah met his gaze, appreciating his directness. "It's different than I expected. My grandfather tried to explain what it would be like, but some things can't be fully explained," Reynolds finished for her. "They have to be experienced." He leaned forward, his demeanor shifting subtly from concerned commander to focused operator. "Sarah, I need to be direct with you. The attack today wasn't random. The individuals involved appear to have connections to your grandfather's past operations, specifically a mission in Somalia in 1993. Sarah felt a chill run through her. "Somalia? My grandfather never mentioned any operations there." "Are you certain?" Reynolds pressed. "Think carefully. Even casual references stories that might have seemed unrelated at the time." Sarah's mind raced through years of conversations with her grandfather searching for any mention of Somalia. He talked about operations in Central America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, but never Somalia specifically. She paused, a memory surfacing. Wait, there was something. Not Somalia directly, but after he had been drinking once, this was years ago, when I was maybe 15, he mentioned a mission gone wrong, an operation that had been compromised from within. Did he give any details? Names, dates, locations? Sarah shook her head. Nothing specific. Just that good men had died because someone in command had made a deal with the wrong people. He was angry. It was one of the few times I ever saw him truly upset. Reynolds nodded slowly, filing this information away. "Sarah, the base commander needs to speak with you. This isn't optional given the circumstances, but I want you to understand that you're not being treated as a suspect in anything. Your actions today potentially saved many lives, including those of my team." "I understand," Sarah replied, her stomach tightening nonetheless. Now, I'll escort you to the command center." Reynolds stood, then hesitated. "One more thing. One of the attackers was carrying a military ID. The name on it was Frank Wilson, a former Army captain who was reportedly killed in action in 1993. Sarah frowned. "The name doesn't mean anything to me." "Are you sure? Think about your grandfather's personal effects journals, photographs, anything that might have contained references to his former teammates or operations." A memory flashed in Sarah's mind, the wooden box in her apartment, with her grandfather's medals and memorabilia. Among the items was a small leather-bound journal filled with cryptic entries and what appeared to be operational notes. There might be something in my grandfather's journal," she admitted. "He kept detailed records of his operations, though much of it is in a personal shorthand that's difficult to decipher." Reynolds's expression intensified. "Where is this journal now?" "At my apartment, in a hidden safe." The commander nodded decisively. "After we meet with Captain Westfield, we'll need to retrieve that journal. If there's any connection between your grandfather and what happened today, that information could be crucial." As Sarah followed Reynolds out of the building toward the command center, She couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that she was being drawn into something far larger and more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. A shadowy world of classified operations and buried secrets that her grandfather had tried to protect her from, even as he prepared her to navigate it, if necessary. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. The carefully constructed identity she had maintained for the past 2 years had been irrevocably shattered. Sarah Miller, the invisible range maintenance specialist, had revealed herself as something far more formidable. Now, she would have to face the consequences of that revelation, for better or worse. The atmosphere in the command center tensed noticeably as Reynolds escorted Sarah through the security checkpoint. Military personnel and intelligence analysts glanced up from their workstations, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Word had clearly spread about the civilian maintenance specialist who had demonstrated exceptional combat capabilities during the attack. Captain Westfield met them at the entrance to the central briefing room, his stern features revealing nothing of his thoughts as he evaluated Sarah with a commander's assessing gaze. "Ms. Miller," he acknowledged formally, "I understand we owe you a debt of gratitude for your actions today." "I just did what was necessary, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the respectful demeanor she had learned to adopt around senior military officers. "Indeed," Westfield gestured toward the briefing room. "Please join us. We have much to discuss." Inside, a small group awaited them, Lieutenant Chen, whom Sarah recognized from occasional encounters around the base. A stern-looking man in a dark suit who practically screamed, "Federal agent," and an older military officer whose uniform identified him as a colonel, though Sarah didn't recognize his unit insignia. "Ms. Miller, this is Special Agent Thomas from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division." Westfield introduced the man in the suit, "and Colonel Richard Bennett from the Defense Intelligence Agency." Sarah nodded politely to each man, though she noted that Colonel Bennett was studying her with particular intensity, as if trying to reconcile her appearance with some preconceived expectation. "Please sit down," Westfield directed, indicating an empty chair at the briefing table. As Sarah took her seat, she caught a glimpse of the materials spread across the table, satellite imagery of the naval base personnel files of the attackers, and, most concerningly, what appeared to be a heavily redacted military file with her grandfather's name visible in the header. "Ms. Miller," Agent Thomas began without preamble, "we understand you're the granddaughter of Master Sergeant James Miller, codenamed Ghost Eye, during his service with Army Special Forces." "Rangers," Sarah corrected automatically. "My grandfather served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, not Special Forces." Thomas exchanged glances with Colonel Bennett before continuing. "The official record indicates Ranger Regiment, yes, but your grandfather's actual operational history was more complex." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Colonel Bennett spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the gravelly quality of a long-time smoker. "What Agent Thomas is attempting to delicately state is that your grandfather's official service record was deliberately sanitized. James Miller served in multiple special operations units throughout his career, often on loan to agencies and task forces that officially didn't exist." Sarah felt a flutter of unease. While her grandfather had occasionally hinted at operations beyond the scope of conventional military deployments, he had never explicitly confirmed involvement with clandestine agencies or black ops programs. "I'm not sure what this has to do with today's attack," she said carefully. "Perhaps everything," Colonel Bennett replied, sliding a photograph across the table. The black and white image showed a group of 6 men in mixed military and civilian attire standing beside what appeared to be a UH-1 Huey helicopter. Sarah immediately recognized her grandfather, younger but unmistakable, standing second from the left. What caught her attention, however, was the man standing next to him, one arm draped casually over her grandfather's shoulder in a gesture of easy camaraderie. "The man next to your grandfather Bennett indicated, is Captain Frank Wilson. This photograph was taken in 1982 prior to a classified operation in Lebanon. Sarah studied the image more carefully. The man had a confident stance, with the relaxed alertness common to experienced operators. His features were unremarkable, the kind of face that could blend into a crowd without drawing attention, which was often an asset in clandestine operations. "I've never seen this photograph before," she admitted. "My grandfather never mentioned anyone named Frank Wilson." "Are you certain?" Agent Thomas pressed. "Perhaps by a nickname or call sign." Sarah shook her head. "My grandfather rarely discussed specific individuals from his service days, and never in detail." Commander Reynolds, who had remained silent until now, interjected. "Captain, perhaps we should explain to Ms. Miller why we're focusing on this connection." Westfield nodded his assent, and Lieutenant Chen activated the main display screen. It showed an image of a military identification card, the same one Reynolds had mentioned earlier. "This ID was recovered from one of the attackers killed during the assault on the data center," Chen explained. "It belongs to Captain Frank Wilson, who was reportedly killed during a classified operation in Somalia in 1993, except he clearly wasn't killed," Sarah finished, understanding dawning. "And now someone using his ID was part of an attack on this base." "The ID is authentic," Agent Thomas confirmed. "Preliminary forensic analysis suggests it's not a forgery, but the original document issued to Wilson in the early 1980s. Sarah's mind raced to process the implications. "You think this attack was personally motivated? Some kind of vendetta connected to my grandfather's past operations?" "It's one theory we're exploring," Westfield acknowledged. "The targeting of the data center is particularly concerning. Initial reports indicate the attackers were attempting to access classified files, specifically historical operation records from the 1980s and early 1990s. Colonel Bennett leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. "Ms. Miller, what do you know about an operation codenamed Eagle Falls?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had seen that codename only once in a redacted document among her grandfather's personal effects after his death. "Just the name," she answered truthfully. "I found a reference to it among my grandfather's papers, but no details." Eagle Falls was a compartmentalized element of Operation Eagle Claw, Bennett explained, naming the infamous failed 1980 hostage rescue mission in Iran. While the main operation focused on the embassy in Tehran, Eagle Falls involved a secondary team tasked with eliminating potential security threats around the extraction route. Sarah nodded slowly. "My grandfather received the Silver Star, but he never discussed the specifics of how he earned it." "That's because Eagle Falls officially never happened," Bennett said flatly. "When the main operation was aborted after the helicopter failures at Desert One, the Eagle Falls team should have been extracted as well. Instead, due to a communication failure, they remained in position for an additional 36 hours, continuing their mission without official sanction or support." The implications were clear. Her grandfather had been part of a mission that, following the abort order for the main operation, had essentially gone rogue. Any actions taken during those 36 hours would have been deniable by the U.S. government if discovered. "What does this have to do with Somalia in 1993? Sarah asked, struggling to connect these disparate elements. Bennett and Westfield exchanged glances, an unspoken communication passing between them. "That's classified at a level beyond this briefing," Bennett replied eventually. "What I can tell you is that Captain Wilson was part of both Operations Eagle Falls in 1980 and the Somalia mission in 1993, as was your grandfather, though in different capacities." Sarah felt a growing frustration. "With respect, Colonel, you're asking me for information about my grandfather's service while withholding context that might help me provide relevant details." She has a point, Reynolds interjected, earning a sharp look from Bennett. Agent Thomas cleared his throat. Perhaps a different approach, Ms. Miller. Commander Reynolds mentioned that you have a journal belonging to your grandfather that might contain operational information. Is that correct? Sarah hesitated. The journal was one of her most private possessions, a tangible connection to her grandfather and his legacy. Surrendering it to government officials, especially given the cryptic nature of this interview, felt like a betrayal of his trust. The journal is personal, she said carefully. My grandfather kept notes on various aspects of his life, including his military service, but much of it is in a personal shorthand that would be difficult for others to interpret. Nevertheless, it could contain vital information related to national security, Thomas pressed. Given the circumstances, we need to examine it immediately. Sarah looked to Reynolds, finding his gaze more sympathetic than the others around the table. Commander, Reynolds addressed Westfield directly. Sir, I suggest a compromise. I'll accompany Ms. Miller to retrieve the journal, and she can review it with us present. That way she can help interpret any shorthand or personal references that might be significant. Westfield considered this for a moment before nodding. Acceptable. But I want this handled quickly. If there's actionable intelligence in that journal regarding Wilson or his associates, we need it now, not after another attack. As the meeting concluded, Sarah found herself escorted from the command center by Reynolds and Agent Thomas, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had learned. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her, trained her, and instilled in her his own strict code of honor, had been involved in classified operations that remained sensitive enough to provoke armed assault on a naval installation decades later. What troubled her most, however, was the sense that Colonel Bennett knew far more about these operations than he was revealing, and that his interest in her grandfather's journal might extend beyond legitimate security concerns. As they left the building toward the parking area where Reynolds's vehicle waited, Sarah caught sight of a figure observing them from the shadow of an adjacent structure. The man was too distant to identify clearly, but something in his posture, the way he held himself alert, yet relaxed, struck a chord of recognition. By the time she turned to point him out to Reynolds, the figure had disappeared, leaving Sarah with an unsettling sensation that the day's events were merely the opening moves in a dangerous game whose rules and players remained largely unknown to her. What she couldn't possibly know was that her decision to reveal her hidden skills during the morning's attack had set in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront not only the buried secrets of her grandfather's past, but also the painful question of whether the man she had idolized had always been the hero she believed him to be. The drive to Sarah's apartment passed in tense silence. Commander Reynolds navigated the San Diego streets with the focused efficiency typical of special operators, while Agent Thomas maintained a watchful vigilance from the back seat. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her mind racing through the implications of everything she had learned in the past few hours. Your grandfather, Reynolds said, finally breaking the silence, he trained you extensively in marksmanship. Was there anything else he taught you? Other operational skills? Sarah hesitated, calculating how much to reveal. Everything, she admitted eventually. Fieldcraft, counter-surveillance, improvised weapons, close-quarters combat. He treated my education as if he were training a future operator, not just a civilian marksman. Reynolds nodded, his expression thoughtful. That explains your performance today. Your movements between firing positions showed tactical awareness beyond basic marksmanship training. My grandfather believed in comprehensive preparation, Sarah replied. He used to say, a sniper who can only shoot is just a liability with an expensive rifle. A ghost of a smile touched Reynolds's lips. Sound philosophy. As they approached Sarah's apartment complex, a prickling sensation at the base of her neck caused her to straighten in her seat. Something's wrong. Reynolds immediately tensed his hands, tightening on the steering wheel. What do you see? Not see, feel. Sarah scanned the street, the apartment buildings, the parked cars. Nothing appeared overtly threatening, yet the sense of wrongness intensified. My grandfather trained me to trust my instincts. Right now they're screaming that something isn't right. Instead of dismissing her concern, Reynolds responded with the seriousness of a combat veteran who understood that intuition often processed threat indicators before conscious awareness could identify them. Thomas, he addressed the FBI agent, call for backup. Have them establish a perimeter around the apartment complex, but maintain distance until we assess the situation. Thomas complied without question, speaking quietly into his phone, as Reynolds continued past Sarah's building without slowing, circling the block to approach from a different angle. Is there another way into your apartment? Reynolds asked. Service entrance, fire escape, anything that wouldn't be obvious to someone watching the main entry. Sarah nodded. There's a maintenance access through the parking garage. My grandfather insisted I choose an apartment with multiple entry and exit points. Smart man, Reynolds murmured, pulling into an adjacent shopping center parking lot where they could observe the apartment complex from a distance. Using a pair of compact binoculars from the glove compartment, Reynolds methodically surveyed the building and surrounding area. Third floor, southeast corner unit, he confirmed. Yes? Your lights are on. Sarah felt her blood run cold. I turned everything off this morning before leaving for work. Standard procedure. Reynolds continued his observation. No obvious signs of forced entry on the exterior. No suspicious vehicles that I can identify. He lowered the binoculars. Could be nothing. Power surge tripping the lights. Maintenance personnel. Or someone searching my apartment. Sarah finished the thought. Let's find out. Reynolds decided, starting the engine again. Thomas, what's the ETA on that backup? 10 minutes, the agent replied. Local PD is establishing an outer perimeter, now staying out of sight as requested. Reynolds nodded and addressed Sarah. Here's how we play this. We approach through the maintenance access. I take point, you follow Thomas, covers our 6. We proceed to your apartment, but don't enter immediately. Clear so far? Clear. Sarah confirmed, grateful for the commander's methodical approach. If there's anyone inside, our priority is identification, not engagement. We need to know who's interested in your grandfather's records and why. Questions. Sarah shook her head, mentally preparing herself for what might lie ahead. They parked in the far corner of the garage, using concrete support pillars as concealment, as they made their way to the maintenance access. Sarah led them through a service corridor that connected to the main building's emergency stairwell. As they ascended to the 3rd floor, Sarah noticed Reynolds moving with the fluid efficiency of a seasoned operator. Minimal noise, maximized awareness, weapon hand kept free and ready. Despite the circumstances, she felt a strange comfort in his competence, reminiscent of the security she had always felt in her grandfather's presence. The 3rd floor corridor was empty and quiet as they approached Sarah's apartment. No signs of disturbance, no unusual sounds. Reynolds gestured for them to stop several doors away, listening intently. You hear that? He whispered. Sarah concentrated, filtering out the ambient building sounds, air conditioning, distant television plumbing. Then she caught it, the faint but distinctive sound of drawers being opened and closed inside her apartment. Someone's searching, she confirmed softly. Reynolds signaled Thomas to cover the hallway while he and Sarah moved closer to the apartment door. They positioned themselves on either side, and Reynolds indicated that Sarah should check if the door had been forced. Carefully, she examined the frame and lock without touching them. Professional job, she whispered. Lock picked, not broken. Reynolds nodded and withdrew his sidearm, a move that revealed just how seriously he was taking the situation. He gestured to Sarah. "Stay back." She shook her head firmly and mouthed, "My apartment, my grandfather's legacy." After a moment's hesitation, Reynolds acknowledged her determination with a slight nod. He held up 3 fingers, counting down silently. As his last finger folded, Reynolds kicked the door open with explosive force, entering in a tactical stance with his weapon raised. "U.S. Navy hands where I can see them." Sarah followed immediately behind him, scanning the apartment with the heightened awareness her grandfather had drilled into her over years of training. The intruder was in the bedroom, a tall, lean man dressed in nondescript dark clothing. Unlike the attackers at the naval base, this individual moved with the precise economy of a trained professional. As Reynolds and Sarah burst in, he was already in motion, diving behind the bed for cover. "Armed!" Reynolds called out, shifting his position to maintain a line of sight on the intruder. The man raised a handgun, a suppressed Sig Sauer by Sarah's quick assessment, but didn't immediately fire. Instead, he called out in a calm, measured voice that carried a hint of an accent Sarah couldn't immediately place. "Commander Reynolds, I presume I've been expecting you." Reynolds maintained his aim, his expression hardening. "Identify yourself." "That's complicated," the man replied. "But the young lady might recognize my face, if not my name." He slowly raised his free hand to remove the dark cap and glasses that had partially obscured his features. As they fell away, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. "You're the man from the photograph," she breathed. "Standing next to my grandfather. Wilson." The man inclined his head slightly. "Captain Frank Wilson, though I haven't used that name in many years." His gaze shifted back to Reynolds. "I'm not here to hurt anyone, Commander. Quite the opposite." "Put the weapon down." Reynolds ordered, his aim unwavering. Slowly. Wilson complied with deliberate movements, placing his pistol on the floor and sliding it away from himself. "May I stand? This position is hell on my knees these days." Reynolds gestured with his weapon. Slowly. "Hands where I can see them." As Wilson rose, Sarah studied him more carefully. The man before her was in his mid-60s, with the weathered features of someone who had spent much of his life outdoors in harsh conditions. His posture and movements suggested military training, but there was something else, a wariness, a hypervigilance that spoke of years spent looking over his shoulder. "Why are you here?" Sarah demanded. "Why were your men attacking the naval base?" Wilson's expression hardened. "Those weren't my men, Ms. Miller. If I had wanted to breach the data center, I wouldn't have sent a frontal assault against a facility full of SEALs." "Then who were they?" Reynolds asked, his weapon still trained on Wilson's chest. "Mercenaries. Hired guns using my old identity as cover." Wilson's gaze returned to Sarah. "They were after the same thing. I am your grandfather's journal." Sarah felt a chill run through her. "How do you know about that?" "Because James told me about it before he died." Wilson's voice softened slightly. "He was my friend for 30 years, Ms. Miller. One of the few people in this world I trusted completely." The sound of movement in the hallway caught their attention. Agent Thomas appeared in the doorway, his own weapon drawn. "Federal agent, drop your—" "Stand down, Thomas," Reynolds interrupted. "Situation is under control." The FBI agent hesitated, then lowered his weapon slightly while maintaining a ready stance. "Who is this?" "That's what we're finding out," Reynolds replied, his attention returning to Wilson. "You're claiming the attackers at Coronado were using your identity as cover. Explain." Wilson sighed, the weariness of decades evident in his expression. "It's a long story, Commander, and we don't have much time. The people behind today's attack know about Ms. Miller now, which means she's in danger. If I found her, they will too. Who are they? Sarah pressed. The same people who betrayed your grandfather and my team in Somalia in 1993. Wilson's eyes hardened with old anger. People with enough influence to bury the truth for 30 years. People who are still in positions of power today. Reynolds and Thomas exchanged glances, the tension in the room palpable. The journal, Wilson continued, addressing Sarah directly. Your grandfather documented everything. Names, dates, operational details. It's the only concrete evidence that could expose what really happened. And what did happen? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wilson's expression darkened. A betrayal that got good men killed for political expediency. An operation deliberately compromised to protect certain interests in Washington. He paused. Your grandfather was the only one who made it out with proof. Sarah processed this, her mind racing. If what you're saying is true, why hasn't my grandfather's journal been taken before now? He's been dead for 5 years. Because no one knew he had documented everything until recently, Wilson explained. James was careful. He kept the journal hidden, told no one about its existence except me, and only in the final weeks of his life. And I'm supposed to just believe you, Sarah challenged. For all I know, you could have been behind the attack today. Wilson met her gaze steadily. Your grandfather had a scar on his right forearm in the shape of a crescent moon. He told people it was from shrapnel in Lebanon, but it was actually from a training accident in Montana when he was 16. He called you Little Ghost because when you were a child you could move through the woods without disturbing a single leaf. His voice softened. And he was more proud of you than anything else in his life. The personal details, things that wouldn't be in any military record, hit Sarah like a physical blow. This man had indeed known her grandfather intimately. The journal, Wilson pressed. We need to secure it now. Colonel Bennett was at the base today, wasn't he? Reynolds' expression sharpened. How did you know that? Because Richard Bennett is exactly who I'd expect to show up when ghosts from Operation Eagle Falls start resurfacing. Wilson's voice carried decades of bitterness. He was our handler for that operation. And later, he was the one who sent us into the trap in Somalia. The pieces were beginning to connect in Sarah's mind, a mosaic of classified operations, betrayal, and long-buried secrets. But something still didn't make sense. If my grandfather knew about this betrayal, why didn't he expose it years ago? He tried, Wilson replied grimly. Through proper channels at first, then through back channels when the official routes were blocked. But Bennett had powerful allies, people who could make evidence disappear, witnesses recant investigations, stall. He shook his head. Your grandfather eventually realized the only way to protect himself and you was to disappear from their radar. Retire quietly, document everything, and wait for the right moment. Now apparently, Reynolds observed his weapon still trained on Wilson, though his stance had relaxed slightly. Now, Wilson confirmed, because Bennett is about to be nominated for a cabinet-level position in national security. If he achieves that level of power and influence, he let the implication hang in the air. Sarah made her decision. Moving to the bedroom closet, she knelt and removed a section of baseboard, revealing the hidden safe she had installed after her grandfather's death. As she entered the combination, she was acutely aware of the 3 men watching her, each with their own agenda, each potentially representing different facets of a truth she was only beginning to comprehend. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing the wooden box with "Rangers Lead the Way" carved into the lid. Sarah removed it carefully, feeling the weight of history, both national and personal, in her hands. As she placed the box on the bed and opened it, the 4 of them gathered around to examine the contents. Sarah lifted out the journal, a weathered, leather-bound volume filled with her grandfather's precise handwriting diagrams and what appeared to be operational notes in a personalized shorthand. "That's it," Wilson breathed a hint of reverence in his voice. "The last 30 years of James Miller's operational knowledge and experience." Sarah hesitated, her hand protectively covering the journal. "I need to know what happened. The full story, not just fragments." Wilson nodded solemnly. "You deserve that much. But not here. This location is compromised, and we need to move before—" The sound of vehicles pulling up outside interrupted him. Reynolds moved swiftly to the window, peering cautiously through the blinds. 3 SUVs, government plates, armed personnel deploying in a tactical formation. He turned back to the group, his expression grim. "They're not here for a social call." "Bennett," Wilson hissed, "he's moving faster than I anticipated. He must have tracked you from the base." Reynolds made a rapid tactical assessment. "Thomas, what's the status on local PD backup?" The FBI agent checked his phone. "They're establishing a perimeter, but if those are federal agents down there, they'll stand down on jurisdictional grounds," Reynolds finished. "We need another exit strategy." Sarah was already moving. "There's a maintenance access to the roof. From there we can cross to the adjacent building. My grandfather made me map every escape route when I moved in." Wilson nodded approvingly. "James taught you well." Reynolds made his decision. "Thomas, you're the only one here with clear legal standing. Delay them, request identification, verification of their orders, anything to buy us time." The FBI agent looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "I can stall them for a few minutes, but not much longer without putting my career on the line." "That's all we need," Reynolds assured him. "Miller Wilson, grab only what's essential. We move in 30 seconds. Sarah quickly transferred the journal and a few key items from the wooden box into a small backpack. As she zipped it closed, she noticed Wilson retrieving his sidearm and checking it with practiced efficiency. "I thought you weren't here to hurt anyone," she observed. Wilson met her gaze without flinching. "I'm not, but neither am I planning to be taken by Bennett's people. Some fates are worse than death, Ms. Miller. Your grandfather understood that." Before Sarah could respond, Reynolds signaled that it was time to move. Thomas exited first, heading toward the apartment's main entrance to intercept the incoming agents. Meanwhile, Sarah led Reynolds and Wilson to a utility closet that concealed the maintenance access to the roof. The narrow metal ladder ascended through a shaft barely wide enough for an adult to navigate. Sarah went first, followed by Wilson, with Reynolds covering their rear. The climb was awkward with the backpack, but Sarah's athletic conditioning made it manageable. As they emerged onto the rooftop, the evening air cool against their faces, Sarah could hear the faint sounds of commotion from below. Raised voices, the crackle of radios, the distinctive cadence of federal agents identifying themselves. "This way," she directed, leading them across the flat roof toward the adjacent apartment building, which stood approximately 8 feet away across an alley. Reynolds assessed the gap. "Doable," he concluded. "Wilson, can you make that jump?" The older man snorted. "I may be in my 60s, Commander, but I've been keeping myself operational. I'll manage." Sarah went first again, taking a short run before launching herself across the gap. She landed solidly on the neighboring rooftop, rolling to distribute the impact, as her grandfather had taught her. Wilson followed with surprising agility for his age, executing a similar landing. Reynolds was preparing to make the jump when the roof access door behind him burst open. 2 men in tactical gear emerged, weapons raised. "Freeze, federal agents!" Instead of complying, Reynolds launched himself across the gap just as the agents opened fire. Bullets impacted the concrete rooftop as he landed hard on the other side, immediately rolling for cover behind a rooftop air conditioning unit. "Go!" he shouted to Sarah and Wilson. I'll cover you! Wilson grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the maintenance door that would lead them into the adjacent building. He's right. We need to move now. Sarah hesitated, reluctant to leave Reynolds behind. But he's a SEAL, Ms. Miller. This is what they trained for. The best way to help him is to secure that journal and expose Bennett before he can bury the truth again. The logic was sound, even if it felt wrong to abandon Reynolds. Sarah nodded sharply and followed Wilson through the maintenance door, descending the stairs rapidly as the sound of gunfire continued above them. They emerged into a residential hallway, startling an elderly woman who was just exiting her apartment. Wilson smiled reassuringly, instantly, transforming his demeanor from hardened operative to harmless senior citizen. "So sorry to startle you, ma'am. Maintenance was checking the roof access. All fixed now." His voice was warm, his body language non-threatening. The woman nodded uncertainly and continued on her way, casting suspicious glances over her shoulder. "Where to now?" Sarah asked quietly as they reached the building's main lobby. Wilson scanned the street through the glass doors. "Bennett's people will have the area surrounded by now. We need transportation." Sarah spotted a delivery driver unloading packages from a van parked directly in front of the building. "I have an idea." Without waiting for Wilson's response, she pushed through the doors and approached the driver with a friendly smile. "Excuse me, are you delivering to apartment 304? That's me, but I'm heading out. I can save you a trip upstairs." The driver harried and, clearly behind schedule, barely glanced at her. "Miller, 304. That's me," Sarah confirmed, noting with relief that her name was indeed on one of the packages. "Sign here." The driver thrust a digital tablet toward her. As Sarah signed, Wilson approached casually from behind, subtly removing the keys from the van's ignition, where the distracted driver had left them. The entire exchange took less than 30 seconds, after which the driver handed Sarah her package and turned to retrieve more from the back of the van. "Now," Wilson murmured, and they both moved swiftly to the vehicle. Wilson slid into the driver's seat, while Sarah took the passenger side. The engine started with a rumble, and Wilson pulled away from the curb before the confused driver could fully process what was happening. "Hey!" the man shouted, running a few steps after them before stopping in bewilderment. Wilson navigated through the residential streets with calm precision, avoiding main thoroughfares where roadblocks might be established. "We need to get clear of the immediate area. Then we'll abandon this vehicle and acquire less conspicuous transportation." Sarah nodded, her training kicking in, despite the surreal nature of the situation. "What about Reynolds?" "If he evades capture, he'll establish contact through secure channels," Wilson replied. "If not, well, Commander Reynolds strikes me as someone who can take care of himself in difficult situations." Sarah wasn't entirely satisfied with this assessment, but recognized the pragmatic reality. Her attention turned to the backpack in her lap containing her grandfather's journal and the secrets that had apparently set these events in motion. "Where are we going?" she asked. Wilson's expression remained focused on the road ahead. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere your grandfather and I established years ago as a fallback position if the truth about Eagle Falls and Somalia ever resurfaced." "And then what?" "Then," Wilson said grimly, "we open that journal and find the evidence needed to bring down Richard Bennett before he can acquire enough power to make himself untouchable." As they drove into the gathering darkness, Sarah felt as if she had crossed an invisible threshold, leaving behind the carefully constructed life she had maintained for the past 2 years, and stepping fully into the shadowy world her grandfather had prepared her for since childhood. Whether that preparation would be enough to survive what lay ahead remained to be seen. Colonel Richard Bennett paced the confines of the secure communications room, his weathered features set in an expression of controlled fury. The monitors before him displayed real-time updates from the field teams deployed to Sarah Miller's apartment complex, none of which contained the news he wanted to hear. "What do you mean, escaped?" he demanded into the secure phone. "You had a full tactical team against 3 individuals, one of whom is a civilian woman." The response from the other end did nothing to improve his mood. Bennett terminated the call with a vicious jab at the screen and turned to face Captain Westfield, who had been observing the exchange with increasing concern. "This situation is rapidly deteriorating," Bennett stated flatly. "Miller Reynolds and an unidentified accomplice have evaded our security teams. Worse, they've acquired documentation that may compromise ongoing national security operations." Westfield frowned. "What documentation exactly?" "I was led to understand this was about historical operations from the 1980s and 90s. How does that constitute a current national security threat?" Bennett's expression remained carefully neutral, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "The past informs the present, Captain. Certain historical operations have continuing implications for current intelligence protocols and relationships." "I see," Westfield replied, though his tone suggested he found the explanation less than satisfactory. "And Commander Reynolds' involvement? He's one of my most trusted officers." "Caught up in something he doesn't understand," Bennett dismissed, "or possibly compromised by his association with Miller. Either way, he's interfering with a classified DIA operation and will face appropriate consequences when apprehended." Westfield straightened his military bearing, becoming more pronounced. "With respect, Colonel, I find it difficult to believe that Reynolds would knowingly interfere with legitimate security operations. His record is exemplary." "Even exemplary officers can be misled by compelling narratives," Bennett countered smoothly. "Miller has clearly spun a convincing tale based on her grandfather's biased accounts." Before Westfield could respond, the secure phone chimed again. Bennett answered, listening intently before his expression hardened further. "Understood. Implement Protocol Obsidian immediately. Full surveillance, activation priority 1. He ended the call and turned to Westfield. "Captain, I need to commandeer additional resources from your security division. This situation has been escalated to a national security priority." "On whose authority?" Westfield challenged, his patience visibly wearing thin. Bennett withdrew a folded document from his inner pocket and handed it to the captain. "Director of National Intelligence, countersigned by the Secretary of Defense. I'm activating a joint task force with full operational autonomy." Westfield scanned the document, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is extraordinarily broad authority, Colonel. Almost unlimited resources and minimal oversight. The threat justifies the response," Bennett stated, simply retrieving the document. "I'll establish my command center here unless you have objections." It wasn't truly a question, and both men knew it. Westfield had just been effectively sidelined in his own facility. "No objections," the captain replied stiffly. "I'll inform my staff to provide whatever assistance you require." As Westfield departed, Bennett returned to the secure communications console, entering a series of access codes that connected him to a classified network few within the military or intelligence community knew existed. "Keystone secure," he stated once the connection was established. "Situation update. Ghost Eye's documentation has been compromised. Primary asset, James Miller, deceased. Secondary asset, Sarah Miller. Current status, fugitive, in possession of critical documentation. Accompanied by unknown accomplice and Naval Commander Jack Reynolds." He paused, listening to the response through his earpiece. "Yes, I understand the implications. Full containment protocol authorized. Primary objective, recover or destroy Ghost Eye's journal. Secondary objective, neutralize all parties with knowledge of its contents. Another pause. Yes, including Reynolds. No witnesses, no loose ends. Bennett terminated the connection and stood motionless for a moment, staring at the satellite imagery of San Diego displayed on the main screen. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Sarah Miller was carrying documentation that could end his career and worse, expose operations that the American public was never meant to know about. Operations that had been necessary regardless of their moral ambiguity or legal standing. Operations that had protected American interests when conventional approaches had failed. James Miller had been a complication, a skilled operator whose conscience had eventually overcome his conditioning. Bennett had managed that threat through careful monitoring and strategic pressure points. But Sarah Miller represented a different kind of danger, someone outside the system immune to the leverage that kept most potential whistleblowers in check. She would have to be dealt with permanently, along with anyone who aided her. Bennett activated a different communication channel. This is Keystone. Activate all sleeper assets in the San Diego area. Priority target, Sarah Miller. Rules of engagement, unrestricted. As acknowledgments filtered in from various field teams, Bennett allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The machinery he had spent decades building was now fully engaged. It was only a matter of time before Sarah Miller discovered that despite her grandfather's training, she was hopelessly outmatched against the resources he could bring to bear. What Bennett couldn't know was that his quarry had already connected with the one person who understood his methodologies intimately, because that person had helped develop them decades earlier, before becoming their target. The abandoned ranch house stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its weathered exterior blending seamlessly with the rugged terrain surrounding it. Located 30 miles east of San Diego, in the sparsely populated backcountry, the property was officially owned by a shell corporation that, if traced diligently enough, would eventually lead to a deceased attorney who had once represented certain classified government interests. Wilson pulled the battered pickup truck, their third vehicle exchange since fleeing the apartment, onto the property via a nearly invisible access road. The truck's headlights were off Wilson, navigating solely by moonlight and memory. "This is it?" Sarah asked skeptically as they approached the dilapidated structure. "Doesn't look particularly secure." Wilson allowed himself a thin smile. "That's rather the point. Appearances can be deceiving, something your grandfather understood better than most." He parked behind the house, concealing the vehicle from casual observation from the main road, though the chances of random passers-by were minimal in this isolated location. "Stay alert," Wilson advised as they exited the truck. "This location hasn't been accessed in years. Need to make sure it hasn't been compromised." Sarah nodded instinctively, scanning their surroundings as her grandfather had taught her. The terrain offered multiple defensive advantages: clear lines of sight in all directions, elevated position, relative to the approaching road, natural features that could provide cover if needed. Wilson led her to what appeared to be a cellar entrance at the rear of the house, rather than heading down the weathered wooden steps. However, he moved to a seemingly unremarkable section of the foundation wall and pressed a specific sequence of bricks. A soft click emanated from within the wall, and a section of the foundation swung inward, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. "Your grandfather's design," Wilson explained. "James always did have a flair for the theatrical when it came to operational security." He produced a flashlight and led the way into the passage, Sarah following close behind. The air was cool and dry, with a faint metallic scent that suggested sophisticated air filtration. After descending approximately 20 feet, the passage opened into a surprisingly modern facility, a reinforced concrete bunker roughly 30 feet square, equipped with basic living amenities, communications equipment, though clearly dated, and what appeared to be a small armory secured behind a steel cage. "Welcome to Ghost Station," Wilson announced, activating the bunker's power systems. Efficient LED lighting illuminated the space, revealing additional details: topographical maps on one wall, a medical treatment area in one corner, and a secure document safe embedded in the concrete. "My grandfather built this," Sarah asked, surveying the facility with newfound appreciation for the depth of James Miller's preparations. "Designed it," Wilson corrected. "I handled the actual construction through cutouts and contractors who never knew what they were really building." He gestured around the space. This was one of 3 such facilities James established after Somalia, places where evidence could be secured, operations planned, and if necessary, a person could disappear for extended periods. Sarah absorbed this information, reconciling the grandfather she had known with the man who had created such elaborate contingency measures. "He never mentioned any of this to me." "He wouldn't have," Wilson replied, moving to a small kitchenette area and examining the supplies. James compartmentalized rigorously. "You were trained in combat skills and fieldcraft, but kept separate from his contingency planning. It was his way of protecting you." "From what exactly?" Sarah pressed, setting her backpack containing the journal on a metal table in the center of the room. Wilson paused, his expression growing distant. "From the knowledge that the government he served for most of his life ultimately betrayed him, betrayed all of us for political expediency." He turned to face her fully. "From the burden of carrying evidence that could destroy careers and possibly destabilize certain international relationships if it ever came to light." Sarah unzipped the backpack and carefully removed her grandfather's journal. "Then perhaps it's time I understood exactly what this evidence contains." Wilson nodded solemnly. "Yes, I believe it is. But first, we need to establish secure communication with Commander Reynolds, assuming he evaded capture." "How?" "We don't have any way to contact him." Wilson moved to what appeared to be an outdated computer system in the corner of the bunker. "Your grandfather and I established certain protocols for situations like this. Emergency communication channels that exist outside conventional networks." As Wilson activated the system, Sarah opened the journal, finally ready to confront the secrets her grandfather had entrusted to her, knowingly or not. The first pages contained what appeared to be standard operational notes, training regimens, equipment specifications, tactical observations. But as she progressed deeper into the journal, the entries became more specific, more troubling. One entry, dated April 18, 1980, caught her attention immediately. "Eagle Falls initiated. Team composition: myself, Wilson Hernandez, Davies Kowalski. Handler Bennett. Primary objective: eliminate security elements along extraction route for main Eagle Claw force. Secondary objective, classified even from team recover documentation from source Redwood regarding Soviet advisory presence. Bennett emphasized secondary objective takes priority if compromise occurs. Troubling directive contradicts standard protocol for personnel recovery. Wilson shares my concerns but maintains operational security. Will proceed as ordered, but documenting divergence from established parameters." Sarah looked up from the journal. "There was a secondary objective for Eagle Falls that wasn't shared with the full team." Wilson had finished his work at the computer terminal and rejoined her at the table. "Yes, standard compartmentalization, or so we thought at the time. It wasn't until later that we realized the significance of that secondary objective." Sarah continued reading, finding entries that documented the chaotic aftermath of the aborted Eagle Claw mission, April 25, 1980, main mission aborted. Received order to extract, but Bennett countermanded, instructed to proceed with secondary objective despite changed circumstances. Wilson objects, but complies under protest. Team morale deteriorating, as extraction window closes. April 26, 1980, reached Redwood Rendezvous. Contact compromised. Firefight resulted in 3 casualties. Hernandez and Davies KIA Kowalski critically wounded. Secured documentation, but at unacceptable cost. Bennett orders immediate extraction, leaving Kowalski despite stabilization possibilities. Wilson and I overruled extracted with Kowalski against orders. April 30th, 1980. Debriefed separately from Wilson. Instructed to omit Redwood objective and Bennett's extraction order regarding Kowalski from official report. Ethical conflict, but complying for now while documenting actual events here. Kowalski died during medical transport. Bennett claims no knowledge of modified extraction orders. First indication of pattern that would become clear years later. Sarah felt a cold anger building as she read. Bennett abandoned wounded personnel and then lied about it in official reports. Wilson's expression darkened with old pain. That was just the beginning. Eagle Falls was the first operation where we saw Bennett's true nature, but it wouldn't be the last. Sarah turned to later entries, finding references to operations throughout the 1980s, Nicaragua, Lebanon, various classified missions in Eastern Europe as the Cold War entered its final phases. Throughout, her grandfather documented a pattern of increasingly questionable decisions by Bennett, particularly regarding intelligence sources and civilian casualties. Then she reached the entries regarding Somalia, dated early 1993, January 15, 1993, briefed for deniable operation in Mogadishu. Extraction of intelligence asset with critical information on clan weapon supplies. Bennett handling personally despite his promotion to command staff. Unusual involvement suggests non-standard parameters. Team composition: Wilson, lead, Matthews, Riley Johnson. Parker with myself as Overwatch Precision Fire Support. January 18, 1993. Mission parameters modified 24 hours before insertion. Additional objective added: secure documentation from assets residents before extraction. Bennett insists documentation contains evidence of weapons transfers that could compromise ongoing UN humanitarian mission. Timing extremely tight, with new objective. Wilson objects, but is overruled. Sarah continued reading, her heart rate accelerating as the journal documented the disastrous outcome. January 20th, 1993. Operation catastrophically compromised. Ambush at both insertion point and asset location suggests prior knowledge of our movement plan. Wilson's team entered main compound while I maintained overwatch from adjacent structure. Observed multiple hostile forces converging with coordinated precision inconsistent with local militia capabilities. Attempted to warn Wilson, but communications jammed. Precision fire eliminated 8 hostiles, but team overwhelmed by superior numbers. Observed Matthews Riley Johnson killed in initial assault. Wilson and Parker captured. Maintained position until nightfall, then attempted infiltration to determine status of survivors. Located Wilson and Parker in basement detention area. Parker deceased, evidence of interrogation. Wilson severely wounded but conscious. Extracted Wilson against considerable opposition. No sign of the intelligence asset, either never present or removed before our arrival. Critical observation: hostiles employed tactical communications and night vision equipment unavailable to Somali forces. Working theory: deliberate setup, possibly by elements within our own command structure. January 25, 1993. Wilson stabilized, but requires advanced medical care unavailable through operational channels. Bennett refuses extraction claims. Mission failure invalidates support protocols. Made decision to use personal emergency exfiltration plan established after Eagle Falls. contacted Mackenzie for private medical evacuation to Kenya. Bennett officially declares mission failed, all personnel KIA. We are now ghosts by our own government's declaration. The question remains, why send us into an ambush? What was in that documentation that was worth sacrificing an entire team? Sarah looked up from the journal, her hands trembling slightly. Bennett deliberately sent your team into an ambush. Why, what could possibly justify that? Wilson's expression was grim. That's what your grandfather spent the next 20 years trying to discover. After Somalia, James went officially dark, allowing Bennett to believe he had died in the operation while actually establishing a network of former operators who had similar experiences with compromised missions. And what did he find? Fragments at first. Financial transfers to offshore accounts corresponding with failed operations. Diplomatic cables discussing containment of operational liabilities. Then, about 3 years before his death, James found something concrete. Wilson leaned forward, his voice dropping. Bennett wasn't just a handler who made bad calls or sacrificed operators for expediency. He was as part of a small group within the intelligence community that has been selectively compromising operations to shape foreign policy outcomes without congressional oversight or presidential authorization. That's treason, Sarah whispered. That's power, Wilson corrected grimly. They would argue they're making necessary decisions that elected officials lack the courage or foresight to make, sacrificing a few operators or assets to maintain strategic relationships or prevent larger conflicts. Sarah continued through the journal, finding entries from the early 2000s documenting her grandfather's investigation. September 12, 2005 correlation established between Bennett's career advancement and compromised operations. Pattern suggests systematic elimination of witnesses or evidence that could expose unauthorized activities. Network now identifies 14 operations between 1978-2001 with similar characteristics: inexplicable, intelligence failures, convenient elimination of key witnesses, subsequent policy shifts, benefiting specific foreign or corporate interests. November 30, 2005. Contact from Wilson confirms Bennett now operating with tacit approval from elements within Director of National Intelligence Office. Official accountability mechanisms compromised. Conventional whistleblowing channels no longer viable. Alternative approach required. March 15, 2006. Documentation secured from former NSA analyst confirming communication intercepts between Bennett and foreign intelligence services prior to Somalia operation. Explicit discussion of team movement plans and timeline. Smoking gun, but requires corroborating evidence to withstand inevitable deniability tactics. The final entries became more personal, more urgent. January 10, 2018 medical diagnosis confirmed. Terminal, 6 to 12 months remaining. Operational security now secondary to ensuring documentation reaches appropriate channels after my death. Sarah remains unaware of full scope of my activities post-retirement. Have prepared her with necessary skills, but kept her insulated from specific knowledge that would make her a target. February 28, 2018. Contacted Wilson through emergency protocol. Arranged final contingency planning. Sarah will inherit my personal effects, including this journal. Wilson will monitor Bennett's activities and make contact if circumstances require Sarah to become active. Regret necessity of involving her, but alternatives exhausted. May 15, 2018. Final entry. Bennett's nomination for undersecretary position delayed, but likely to proceed within 5 to 7 years based on current political trends. Once he achieves cabinet-level authority, accountability becomes virtually impossible. This journal, combined with Wilson's testimony and the Redwood documentation constitutes complete evidence package required for prosecution. To Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm sorry for the burden this places on you. The training wasn't just for your protection, it was preparation for this moment. Trust Wilson. Trust your instincts. And remember that sometimes the only way to honor your country is to expose those who betray its principles while claiming to protect them. Sarah closed the journal, emotion threatening to overwhelm her composure. The grandfather she had idolized had been carrying this burden alone for decades, preparing her for a role she never knew she might have to fill. "He knew," she said softly. "He knew that someday I might have to finish what he started." Wilson nodded solemnly. James hoped it wouldn't come to that. He established multiple contingency plans, alternative channels for the evidence to emerge. But Bennett has been methodically eliminating those options over the years. When we received intelligence about his impending nomination for a cabinet position, I knew we had to act. So, the attack on the naval base today, Bennett attempting to secure any documentation that might connect him to Eagle Falls or Somalia, Wilson confirmed. He likely had no idea you were there or that you possessed the journal. That was an unfortunate coincidence, or perhaps fate. Sarah considered this. But how did he know to look at Coronado in the first place? Wilson frowned. That's the question that troubles me most. Someone must have tipped him off about a connection between your grandfather's documentation and the naval base. But who knew you were there, or that you were James Miller's granddaughter? Before Sarah could respond, a soft beeping emanated from the computer terminal Wilson had activated earlier. He moved swiftly to the system, checking the incoming communication. "It's Reynolds," he announced, relief evident in his voice. He evaded Bennett's people and is requesting rendezvous coordinates. "Can we trust him?" Sarah asked, newly cautious after what she had learned. Wilson considered the question. "Your grandfather was an excellent judge of character. If he trusted you to recognize allies, then I'm inclined to trust your assessment of Reynolds." "What's your instinct?" Sarah thought about the SEAL commander, his actions during the attack, his protection of her afterward, his willingness to challenge Bennett's narrative rather than accepting it at face value. "I think we can trust him," she decided. "At least enough to bring him in and assess his reaction to what we've discovered." Wilson nodded. "Then let's arrange the rendezvous, but with appropriate security protocols." As Wilson began encrypting the response to Reynolds, Sarah returned to the journal, examining some of the operational details more closely. One reference in particular caught her attention, repeated mentions of something called Redwood documentation that her grandfather considered central to exposing Bennett's activities. "Wilson," she called, "what exactly is the Redwood documentation? My grandfather mentions it repeatedly, but never specifies what it contains." Wilson finished his communication task before answering, his expression grave. Redwood was a code name for a Soviet defector during the late Cold War period, a high-level KGB officer who was providing intelligence on Soviet operations in the Middle East. The documentation he provided during the Eagle Falls operation included evidence of a separate channel of communication between certain American officials and the KGB operating outside official diplomatic or intelligence protocols. "Bennett was working with the Soviets?" Sarah asked, shocked. "Not exactly working with them," Wilson clarified. "More like selectively trading information to shape outcomes in ways that served particular interests. Sometimes American interests, sometimes private or corporate interests, occasionally foreign interests, when it aligned with their long-term objectives. The documentation provided proof that operations were being compromised not due to intelligence failures, but by deliberate design." Sarah processed this revelation, the implications staggering. And in Somalia, by 1993, The Soviet Union had collapsed, but the same methodology continued with different players. The Somalia operation was compromised to prevent exposure of unauthorized weapons transfers to certain clan leaders, transfers that Bennett and his associates had facilitated to maintain control over regional resource development. "Where is this Redwood documentation now?" Wilson's expression tightened. "That's the final piece of the puzzle. Your grandfather separated the evidence for security purposes. The journal documents the pattern and provides his first-hand testimony. I can provide corroboration for the Somalia operation, but the original Redwood documentation, the physical proof of the unauthorized communications channel, is in a secure location known only to your grandfather." "But he's gone," Sarah said, frustration evident in her voice. "Yes, but he would have left a way for you to find it," Wilson assured her. "James Miller never created a security protocol without a redundancy, and he never established a contingency without ensuring the right people could activate it when necessary." Sarah returned to the journal, leafing through it more carefully now, looking for any clue or hidden message her grandfather might have left. As she neared the final pages, she noticed something unusual. A series of numbers notated in the margins of several entries, seemingly random and unrelated to the text they accompanied. "Wilson," she called, "look at these notations. They appear on multiple pages, but don't correspond to the content of the entries." Wilson examined the numbers, his expression sharpening with recognition. "These aren't random. They're coordinates, latitude and longitude, but encoded using a system James and I developed during our time in Lebanon." Working quickly, Wilson decoded the notations, converting them to standard geographical coordinates. These point to a location in the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. Remote, difficult terrain. He looked up at Sarah. "A perfect place to secure documentation you don't want found accidentally." "My grandfather took me camping in the Sierra Nevadas multiple times when I was younger," Sarah recalled. "He always insisted on teaching me navigation techniques, wilderness, survival skills. I thought it was just part of his outdoor enthusiasm, but—" "He was preparing you," Wilson finished, "ensuring you would have the skills necessary to retrieve the documentation if it ever became necessary." The computer terminal beeped again, indicating a new communication. Wilson checked it quickly. "Reynolds has acknowledged the rendezvous instructions. He'll meet us at the fallback position in 3 hours." Sarah nodded, her mind racing as she processed everything she had learned and the implications for what lay ahead. "So, what's our next move?" Wilson's expression was resolute. "We secure the Redwood documentation. Without it, the journal and my testimony won't be enough to counter Bennett's influence and resources. He'll simply deny everything, classify our claims as the delusions of disgruntled former operators, and continue his ascent to power. And with the documentation, with complete evidence, we can approach certain congressional oversight committees, specific journalists with reputations for integrity, and a few remaining intelligence officials not compromised by Bennett's network." Wilson's eyes reflected decades of patient planning. "Your grandfather established the groundwork for this contingency years ago. The channels exist. We just need the complete evidence package to activate them." Sarah closed the journal, a sense of clarity and purpose settling over her. The invisible woman who had spent years maintaining shooting ranges for Navy SEALs was stepping fully into the role her grandfather had prepared her for, not just as a skilled marksman, but as the carrier of truth that powerful forces had spent decades trying to bury. "Bennett won't stop coming after us," she observed. "No," Wilson agreed grimly. "Once he realizes we have the journal and are pursuing the Redwood documentation, he'll deploy every resource at his disposal. The next 48 hours will determine whether your grandfather's final mission succeeds or fails." As if to emphasize his point, The bunker's perimeter alarm suddenly activated a silent flashing light, indicating movement on the property above. "Company?" Wilson said tersely, moving swiftly to the surveillance system. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the main road." Sarah joined him at the monitor, watching as 3 black SUVs with government plates made their way up the access road toward the abandoned ranch house. "Bennett works quickly," she observed, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "How did they find us so fast?" Wilson's expression darkened. "The better question might be, who led them here?" As the vehicles deployed tactical teams in a standard search pattern around the property, Sarah and Wilson exchanged a grim look. The confrontation with Bennett's forces and the truth about who might have betrayed their location would come sooner than either had anticipated. The chase for the Redwood documentation and the final proof of a decades-long conspiracy had officially begun. "Secondary exit tunnel," Wilson announced, moving swiftly to what appeared to be a solid concrete wall. He pressed a concealed panel, revealing a recessed handle. "Your grandfather insisted every fallback position have at least 2 escape routes." Sarah was already gathering essential supplies, the journal weapons, communications equipment, and basic survival gear, and stowing them in a tactical backpack. "What about Reynolds?" she asked. "He's heading to the rendezvous point, expecting to meet us." Wilson's expression hardened as he pulled the handle, revealing a narrow passage beyond the false wall. "That's assuming Reynolds isn't the one who led them here." "But you think he betrayed us?" Sarah couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. "I think we can't rule out any possibilities." Wilson checked the surveillance feed one final time. "Bennett's teams are conducting a standard search pattern of the main house. We have maybe 5 minutes before they locate the bunker entrance." Sarah hesitated, unwilling to abandon Reynolds if he was truly an ally. "We need to warn him at least. If he's legitimate and walks into a trap." Wilson considered this, then nodded sharply. "You're right. Your grandfather would say the same." He moved to the communications terminal and typed rapidly. "Sending an encrypted message to the emergency channel. If Reynolds is compromised, Bennett already knows our fallback protocols. If he's not, then we're giving him a fighting chance," Sarah finished. With the message sent, they entered the escape tunnel, a narrow passage reinforced with steel and concrete, barely wide enough for a person to traverse. The air was stale but breathable, suggesting the ventilation system remained functional despite years of disuse. "This leads to a drainage culvert approximately half a mile from the property," Wilson explained as they moved through the darkness, their way illuminated only by small emergency lights embedded in the floor. "From there, we'll need to reach alternate transportation and head east." "East?" Sarah questioned. "The Sierra Nevada coordinates." "Eventually," Wilson confirmed. "But first, we need to meet a contact of your grandfather's, someone who can provide additional context for the Redwood documentation and potentially help us identify how Bennett tracked us to the safe house." They continued in silence for several minutes, the sounds of their movement echoing softly in the confined space. Sarah's mind raced, processing everything she had learned from her grandfather's journal. The man she had idolized had carried burdens far heavier than she had ever imagined, fighting a shadow war against corruption within the very institutions he had sworn to serve. "How much further?" she asked, more to break the tension than from impatience. "Another 200 yards, Wilson replied. "Listen for water flow that will indicate we're nearing the drainage outlet." Soon, the distant sound of running water reached them, growing louder as they approached the tunnel's end. Wilson paused at a final barrier, a steel grate designed to resemble an ordinary drainage cover. "Stay back," he instructed, drawing a compact pistol from his waistband. "I'll check for surveillance before we exit." Sarah complied, watching as Wilson carefully manipulated a concealed mechanism that unlocked the grate. He pushed it open just enough to survey their surroundings, his movements deliberate and practiced, despite his age. After a tense moment, he signaled all clear and pushed the grate fully open, revealing a concrete culvert opening onto a dry creek bed surrounded by scrub brush and boulders. The moonlight provided just enough illumination to navigate the rough terrain. "This way," Wilson directed, leading her along the creek bed toward what appeared to be an abandoned service road. "Your grandfather cached an emergency vehicle approximately half a mile from here." "A vehicle that's been sitting unused for years?" Sarah questioned skeptically. Wilson's expression showed a hint of amusement. "James was thorough. The vehicle is maintained by a local associate, a former Marine who owes your grandfather his life. Checked and serviced every 6 months, fuel replaced regularly, battery maintained." They reached the service road and followed it to a weather-beaten storage shed partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. Wilson approached a padlocked door and entered a combination on the lock. "Your grandfather's service number," he explained as the lock opened. "Backwards, then reversed." Inside the shed sat a dusty but well-maintained Jeep Wrangler, at least 15 years old, but obviously mechanically sound. Wilson conducted a quick inspection before nodding with satisfaction. "Keys are in a magnetic case under the rear fender," he instructed. "Check while I complete the final security protocol." Sarah located the hidden key case while Wilson returned to the shed entrance, activating what appeared to be another concealed mechanism. "Remote alert system," he explained upon returning. "If Bennett's people find this location, we'll receive warning through a secure channel." As they prepared to depart, Sarah paused, a sudden realization striking her. "My grandfather's journal mentioned Redwood was a Soviet defector during the Cold War, but the documentation he provided proving Bennett's unauthorized communications with foreign elements that would be over 40 years old now. Would it still be relevant enough to threaten Bennett today?" Wilson's expression grew solemn as he started the Jeep's engine. "The Redwood documentation isn't just historical, Sarah. It's the first link in a chain of evidence that spans decades. What began as unauthorized communications with Soviet intelligence evolved into something far more extensive after the Cold War ended, a shadow network of influence operating across multiple agencies and administrations." He guided the vehicle onto a barely visible trail leading away from the service road. "Bennett and his associates have been selectively compromising operations, manipulating intelligence, and eliminating threats to their power for over 40 years. The Redwood documentation proves it didn't begin as rogue individuals making bad calls under pressure. It was a deliberate, systematic effort from the very beginning." Sarah absorbed this as they bounced along the rough trail, eventually connecting with a small paved road heading east into the mountains. "Who are we meeting?" she asked after several minutes of silent driving. "Margaret Carlyle," Wilson replied. "Former DIA analyst specialized in Soviet operations during the late Cold War period. She worked with your grandfather on the intelligence assessment of the Redwood materials originally." "Can we trust her?" Wilson's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Your grandfather trusted her. That's good enough for me." As they continued into the night, Sarah found herself wondering about the man beside her, a ghost from her grandfather's past, who had materialized at the precise moment she needed guidance. Wilson had known exactly where to find her grandfather's journal, had access to secure facilities and communications channels established decades earlier, and navigated this shadow world with the confidence of someone who had never truly left it. "How did you survive?" she asked suddenly. "After Somalia, my grandfather's journal said you were severely wounded." Wilson was silent for a long moment before responding. "James got me out against impossible odds. Arranged private medical care in Kenya through contacts outside official channels. Bennett had already declared us KIA, so technically, I no longer existed. And afterward, recovery took nearly a year. By then, James had established the beginnings of what would become our contingency network. Former operators, intelligence analysts, and support personnel who had either witnessed similar compromised operations or had access to evidence of the pattern. Wilson's voice carried the weight of decades spent in the shadows. I became the field component, while your grandfather managed the intelligence gathering and documentation. We were building a case, piece by piece, that could eventually expose Bennett and his entire network. But something went wrong, Sarah surmised. Wilson nodded grimly. About 10 years ago, Bennett somehow identified several members of our network. 3 former operators died in accidents within a 6-month period. 2 intelligence analysts disappeared completely. James and I realized we'd been compromised, not completely, but enough to force us deeper underground. That's when my grandfather fully retired to Montana, Sarah realized. When I was in college, he said it was for his health, but it was protective isolation, Wilson confirmed. Minimizing his digital footprint, operating only through secure cutouts, focusing on documenting everything, while I maintained what remained of our field network. They fell silent again as Wilson navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of mountain road. Sarah's mind turned to Commander Reynolds, wondering if he had received their warning message and whether he was truly an ally or another element in Bennett's expansive web of influence. Colonel Richard Bennett stood before the main tactical display, his weathered features set in an expression of controlled fury. The screen showed satellite imagery of the abandoned ranch property, with tactical teams reporting in real time as they completed their search. "Confirm again," he demanded of the team leader. "The bunker was empty." "Yes, sir," came the response through the secure channel. "Evidence of recent occupation power systems active supplies disturbed. But no sign of Miller or Wilson. We located a tunnel system extending beyond the property perimeter. Teams are tracking the exit point now." Bennett slammed his fist against the console, startling the junior intelligence officers working nearby. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Not only had Sarah Miller acquired her grandfather's journal, but she had somehow connected with Frank Wilson, the one man who could corroborate James Miller's allegations with first-hand testimony. "Sir," a communications specialist interrupted, "we've intercepted a partial encrypted transmission from the bunker's systems. It was sent approximately 10 minutes before our teams breached the facility." "Content," Bennett demanded, "encrypted using an obsolete DIA protocol. We're working on decryption now, but preliminary analysis suggests it was directed to a mobile receiver within 30 miles of the location." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "Reynolds, sir." The message was intended for Commander Reynolds. Bennett turned to his second-in-command, a severe-looking woman in civilian attire. "Activate the tracking protocol on Reynolds's phone and vehicle immediately. If he received that message, he'll lead us straight to Miller and Wilson." "Already done, sir," the woman replied efficiently. "Last signal placed him moving east on Highway 8 approximately 40 minutes ago. Signal then terminated, likely the phone was destroyed or the battery removed." Bennett considered this information, his tactical mind assessing implications and contingencies. "They're heading for the mountains. The question is, why Nur?" He paced the command center, thinking aloud. "Miller has the journal. Wilson provides corroborating testimony. What else would they need?" The answer struck him with sudden clarity. The Redwood documentation. James Miller would have secured it separately from his personal records. He turned to his team. "New priority: identify any property or secure storage locations owned by James Miller or his known associates in the eastern Sierra Nevada region." "And that's a substantial geographic area, sir," one of the intelligence analysts observed. without more specific parameters. Then find me those parameters, Bennett snapped. Check land records, tax filings, utility connections, anything that might indicate a location significant to Miller, and get me everything we have on Margaret Carlyle. The mention of the name caused a ripple of reaction among the senior staff present. One of the intelligence officers looked up sharply. "Carlyle, sir, I thought she was deceased." "Officially, yes," Bennett replied coldly. "Just like Wilson was officially killed in Somalia. We can't afford to make assumptions at this point." As his team scrambled to execute his orders, Bennett moved to a secure communication terminal and initiated a connection to an unlisted number. "Situation update," he stated without preamble when the connection was established. "Miller and Wilson have evaded initial containment efforts. Evidence suggests they're pursuing the Redwood documentation." The voice that responded was distorted by encryption algorithms, revealing nothing about the speaker's identity. "This is an unacceptable development, Richard. The nomination hearing is scheduled for next month. Any complications must be eliminated immediately." "I understand the timeline," Bennett replied, a rare edge of defensiveness in his tone. "But we're dealing with contingency measures established by James Miller, one of the most thorough operational planners in agency history. He prepared for this scenario extensively." "Then perhaps you should have eliminated those contingencies years ago as recommended." Bennett's jaw tightened at the implied criticism. Miller was more valuable alive and monitored than eliminated and martyred. His network was contained, his evidence isolated. Until now. And how did this containment failure occur exactly? "We're still determining the precise sequence," Bennett evaded. "Current priority is recovering or neutralizing all elements of Miller's evidence package before they can be consolidated and distributed." "See that you do," the voice replied coldly. "The Oversight Committee has invested too much in your advancement to have it derailed by ghosts from Eagle Falls. Complete authorization for all necessary measures is granted. No restrictions, no witnesses." "Understood," Bennett acknowledged, terminating the connection. He stood motionless for a moment, feeling the weight of 4 decades of carefully calculated decisions pressing down upon him. Bennett had long ago justified his actions as necessary for national security. Difficult choices made when conventional channels were too constrained by legalities or politics to address existential threats. The fact that those choices had also advanced his career and increased his influence was in his mind merely a beneficial side effect of placing the right person in positions of appropriate authority. The fact that certain operations had been compromised, certain assets sacrificed, was simply the cost of maintaining American interests in an unforgiving world. James Miller had never understood that. For all his operational brilliance, Miller had remained bound by outdated concepts of honor and transparent accountability that had no place in modern intelligence work. His insistence on documenting irregularities and ethical concerns had transformed him from a valuable asset into a potential liability. And now his granddaughter, trained in his methods, but untainted by the system's compromise mechanisms, threatened to expose 40 years of necessary shadows to the disinfecting light of public scrutiny. Bennett returned to the tactical display, his resolve hardening. "Expand the search parameters. I want surveillance on every road, trail, and passage through the eastern mountains. Alert TSA Border Patrol and State Police with appropriate cover stories." He paused, then added, "And put Commander Reynolds on the priority target list. If he's aiding Miller, he's now classified as a direct threat to national security." As his orders were relayed to the expanding containment operation, Bennett permitted himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He had faced threats to his position before, had eliminated obstacles far more formidable than a range maintenance specialist and a ghost from Somalia. Sarah Miller would soon learn what happened to those who challenged the systems that truly governed American power. Commander Jack Reynolds drove with mechanical precision, his trained senses constantly scanning for surveillance or pursuit as he navigated the winding mountain highway. The motorcycle he had acquired, purchased with cash from a private seller after abandoning his compromised vehicle, handled the curves with responsive agility. The encrypted message from Wilson had reached him just in time, warning of a potential ambush at the original rendezvous point. Reynolds had immediately changed course, destroyed his phone, and implemented the alternate contact protocol specified in the message. As a SEAL commander, Reynolds was accustomed to adapting to changing tactical situations. What he wasn't accustomed to was finding himself on the wrong side of his own government's intelligence apparatus. The implications of what he had witnessed at the naval base, combined with Bennett's obvious determination to silence Miller and anyone associated with her, painted a disturbing picture of corruption at the highest levels. Reynolds had spent his entire career operating within the system, trusting the chain of command, even when individual missions seemed questionable. The possibility that portions of that system were fundamentally compromised challenged everything he had built his professional identity upon. He rounded a sharp curve and immediately noticed the roadblock ahead, two police cruisers positioned across the highway, lights flashing. Standard procedure suggested a routine checkpoint, but Reynolds's combat instincts registered subtle inconsistencies. The positioning of the vehicles offered no escape route. The officers stood in tactical stances rather than casual checkpoint postures. Most tellingly, there were no visible signs indicating an official checkpoint or detour. Reynolds made his decision in a split second, gunning the motorcycle's engine and veering sharply onto a fire access road just before the roadblock. Behind him, he heard shouting and the squeal of tires as the cruisers scrambled to pursue. The access road was unpaved and treacherous, switchbacking up the mountainside through dense forest. Reynolds pushed the motorcycle to its limits, using his body weight to navigate the tight turns while maintaining maximum possible speed. His military training included extensive motorcycle operation in adverse conditions, a skill set that was now proving unexpectedly vital. The sound of pursuit faded as he increased his lead on the larger, less maneuverable police vehicles. After several minutes of intense riding, Reynolds spotted a narrow game trail branching off from the access road. He took the turn, cutting his engine immediately after clearing the main path. In the sudden silence, Reynolds could hear the distant sound of the police cruisers still following the main access road, unaware that he had diverted. He pushed the motorcycle into the underbrush, concealing it from casual observation, then proceeded on foot through the forest. According to the coordinates in Wilson's message, the secondary rendezvous point was approximately 3 miles northeast of his current position, a remote fire observation tower that had been decommissioned years earlier. On foot through mountainous terrain, the journey would take several hours. Reynolds moved with the disciplined efficiency that had made him an exceptional special operator, maintaining awareness of his surroundings while conserving energy. His mind, however, continuously processed the implications of the coordinated effort to intercept him. The roadblock hadn't been a coincidence or routine law enforcement activity. Bennett had leveraged his authority to deploy local assets against a decorated Navy commander without apparent oversight or authorization. That level of operational autonomy suggested either extraordinary emergency powers or a system of influence that circumvented normal chains of command. Neither possibility boded well for what Sarah Miller and Frank Wilson were alleging about Bennett's decades-long activities. As Reynolds navigated the challenging terrain, his thoughts turned to Miller herself, the unassuming range maintenance specialist who had revealed exceptional combat capabilities when circumstances demanded. Her performance during the attack on the naval base had demonstrated not just marksmanship skills, but tactical awareness and decision-making abilities that rivaled those of his most experienced operators. For 2 years, she had maintained her cover perfectly invisible among the warriors who trained daily on her ranges. Reynolds couldn't help but respect both her discipline and her purpose, carrying forward her grandfather's legacy while developing the skills necessary to complete his mission, if required. The question now was whether they could assemble the evidence needed to expose Bennett's operation before his resources overwhelmed them. Reynolds had seen the tactical display in the command center before his escape. The expanding search parameters, the coordination across multiple agencies, the mobilization of assets typically reserved for counterterrorism operations. Bennett was bringing the full weight of his influence to bear, which meant their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. A sound in the distance caught Reynolds' attention, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors. He immediately sought cover beneath a dense canopy of pine trees, minimizing his thermal signature as the aircraft approached. Through gaps in the foliage, Reynolds identified a military helicopter, not standard search and rescue, but a specialized variant used by certain intelligence agencies for surveillance operations. The aircraft moved in a methodical search pattern across the mountainside, its advanced imaging systems capable of detecting heat signatures and movement even through moderate forest cover. Reynolds remained motionless until the helicopter passed beyond his position, then resumed his journey with heightened caution. The deployment of such specialized assets confirmed his suspicions. Bennett had classified this as a national security operation, granting him access to capabilities far beyond normal law enforcement resources. As darkness deepened across the mountains, Reynolds calculated he had covered approximately half the distance to the rendezvous point. The challenging terrain and need for stealth had slowed his progress, but he estimated he would reach the observation tower shortly after midnight. What he would find there, allies, enemies, or an empty outpost, remained to be seen. But for now, his course was clear: reach the rendezvous, connect with Miller and Wilson if possible, and help secure the evidence needed to expose whatever corruption had taken root within the system he had served faithfully for his entire career. Some missions weren't about following orders, Reynolds reflected as he continued through the darkness. Some were about honoring the deeper principles those orders were meant to serve. The small cabin was barely visible from the narrow mountain road, its weathered exterior blending with the surrounding pines and boulders. A single light burned in the front window, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the pitch darkness of the surrounding wilderness. Wilson parked the Jeep in a natural depression behind the cabin, concealing it from casual observation. "We walk from here," he instructed. "Margaret maintains certain security protocols for visitors." Sarah nodded, collecting her backpack containing her grandfather's journal and following Wilson along a barely discernible path toward the cabin. Despite the apparent isolation, she noted subtle security measures as they approached: motion sensors, disguised as rocks, infrared cameras, concealed in tree branches, and what appeared to be pressure plates beneath certain sections of the path. "Stop," Wilson commanded softly when they were approximately 50 yards from the cabin. He removed a small device from his pocket and entered a sequence of numbers. "Disarming the perimeter alerts. Margaret would be notified of our approach otherwise." "Seems like excessive security for a retired analyst," Sarah observed. Wilson's expression remained grim. Margaret Carlyle wasn't just any analyst. She was the DIA's foremost expert on Soviet active measures and psychological operations. When she identified inconsistencies in certain intelligence assessments involving Redwood, she became a potential liability to Bennett's operation. What happened? Official records state she died in a house fire in 1996. The reality is, your grandfather extracted her after receiving warning of a planned accident. She's been living off the grid ever since, continuing to analyze intelligence through a network of former colleagues who share her concerns about institutional corruption. They reached the cabin door, and Wilson knocked in a distinctive pattern: 3 rapid taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. After a moment, The sound of multiple locks disengaging came from within, and the door opened to reveal an elderly woman with sharp blue eyes and silver hair cut in a practical short style. "You're late, Frank," she stated matter-of-factly, her gaze immediately shifting to assess Sarah. "And you've brought James's granddaughter. Circumstances must be deteriorating faster than anticipated." "Bennett's launched a full containment operation," Wilson confirmed as they entered the cabin. "He knows about the journal and suspects we're after the Redwood documentation." Margaret Carlyle secured the door behind them, re-engaging an impressive array of locks and security systems. The cabin's interior was surprisingly modern compared to its rustic exterior. Advanced communications equipment occupied one corner, multiple computer systems hummed efficiently on a large desk, and the walls were covered with maps, photographs, and what appeared to be intelligence assessments in various stages of completion. "So," Margaret said, turning her penetrating gaze on Sarah, "you've finally learned what your grandfather was really preparing you for." Sarah met the older woman's eyes directly. "I'm still learning, but yes, I understand now that my training wasn't just for personal protection." Margaret nodded approvingly. "James spoke of you often, said you had the same intuitive understanding of complex systems that made him such an effective operator." She gestured toward a battered wooden table. "Let's see the journal." Sarah removed the leather-bound volume from her backpack and placed it on the table. Margaret handled it with obvious reverence, her fingers tracing the worn cover before carefully opening it to examine the contents. "James's documentation was always meticulous," she observed, leafing through the pages. "It's what made him such a valuable intelligence asset, and such a threat, when he began documenting the wrong things." "The journal references Redwood documentation repeatedly," Sarah explained. "Apparently, it provides proof of unauthorized communications between Bennett and Soviet intelligence during Operation Eagle Falls." Margaret looked up sharply. "It's far more than that. The Redwood material James secured includes comprehensive evidence of a shadow network operating within multiple intelligence agencies since the late 1970s. Communications, financial transfers, operational sabotage, all documented with primary source material that can't be dismissed as conspiracy theories or the ravings of disgruntled former operatives. Which is why Bennett is throwing everything he has at finding us," Wilson added grimly. Margaret moved to one of her computer systems, typing rapidly. "Bennett's resources are even more extensive than you realize. I've been monitoring communications across multiple agencies. He's implemented a Level 1 sanction protocol, essentially a capture or kill authorization with no jurisdictional limitations or oversight requirements." She turned the screen to show them a classified operations order bearing Bennett's digital signature. "Every federal law enforcement and intelligence asset in the western United States has been activated under a counter-terrorism pretext. Roadblocks, aerial surveillance, digital monitoring. They're creating a net that will be nearly impossible to slip through using conventional methods." "Then we don't use conventional methods," Sarah stated firmly. "The journal contains encoded coordinates in the Sierra Nevadas. We believe that's where my grandfather secured the Redwood documentation." Margaret studied the relevant pages, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "These coordinates, they're within 50 miles of our current location. If Bennett's analysts decode them as you have, they will," Wilson interrupted. "It's only a matter of time. We need to move immediately." "There's a complication," Margaret said, returning to her computer. "The location indicated by these coordinates has been under surveillance for the past 72 hours. Not Bennett's people, private security contractors working for Meridian Resource Development." "What's Meridian's connection to this?" Wilson demanded. Margaret's expression darkened. "Meridian is a front company established in the mid-1980s primarily funded through black budget allocations channeled through multiple cutouts. Its official purpose is resource assessment and acquisition in politically sensitive regions. Its actual purpose is providing operational support and financial infrastructure for Bennett's unauthorized activities. She displayed satellite imagery showing a remote mountain location with what appeared to be a small research station. Several vehicles were visible along with armed personnel establishing a perimeter. This surveillance began 3 days ago before the attack on the naval base, before you recovered the journal, Margaret continued, which means Bennett already knew about the Redwood documentation's location. Sarah finished the implication sinking in. But how my grandfather never told anyone except Wilson. A heavy silence fell over the cabin as the three of them processed the disturbing conclusion. Finally, Wilson spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We have a leak. Someone who knew about James's contingency plans. Someone who's been feeding information to Bennett, possibly for years." "But who?" Sarah pressed. "The only people who knew about the journal were you and my grandfather." Wilson's expression hardened. "And whoever your grandfather might have confided in during his final months. He was dying, Sarah. People in that situation sometimes seek closure, make confessions, tie up loose ends." "We need to focus on the immediate tactical situation," Margaret interrupted. "If Bennett's people are already at the Redwood location, our priority must be determining whether the documentation is still secure." She returned to the satellite imagery enhancing specific sections. "The structure at these coordinates is a former U.S. Geological Survey research station decommissioned in the late 90s. Your grandfather acquired it through a series of shell companies approximately 15 years ago. That fits with when he began consolidating his documentation," Wilson noted, "after the third attempt on his life." Margaret nodded. "The facility includes a reinforced underground level originally designed for seismic monitoring equipment. If James secured the Redwood documentation there, it would likely be in a concealed vault or safe room within that underground structure. So even if Bennett's people have found the location, they might not have accessed the documentation yet." Sarah surmised hope edging into her voice. "Possibly," Margaret acknowledged. "But with their resources, and James no longer alive to implement countermeasures, it's only a matter of time." Wilson studied the satellite imagery with a tactician's eye. 8 visible personnel, likely more inside the structure. Standard private military contractor deployment pattern. These aren't just security guards. They're former special operations, well-equipped and well-trained. "We'd need a small army to breach that perimeter conventionally," Margaret observed. "Or one exceptionally skilled shooter with the right support," Wilson countered, glancing at Sarah. "James trained you for exactly this scenario, whether you realized it or not. Precision elimination of security elements, tactical infiltration, secure extraction of high-value intelligence." Sarah felt the weight of her grandfather's expectations settling on her shoulders. Everything in her life, the countless hours on shooting ranges, the fieldcraft training disguised as wilderness survival skills, the engineering education that gave her understanding of security systems, had been preparation for this moment. "I can do it," she stated simply. "But I'll need proper equipment, detailed facility layouts, and a diversion to thin their security cordon." Margaret was already moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the cabin. "James left certain resources here for contingency purposes. I believe you'll find them adequate for your requirements." The cabinet contained an impressive array of specialized equipment, a disassembled precision rifle, in a custom-cased tactical clothing communications gear, and various infiltration tools. Each item was meticulously maintained despite years of storage, typical of her grandfather's thorough approach to contingency planning. As Sarah examined the equipment, Wilson and Margaret conferred over the satellite imagery identifying approach vectors and security vulnerabilities. Their discussion was interrupted by a soft alert tone from one of the perimeter sensors. "Someone's approaching from the northwest," Margaret announced, checking a security monitor. "Single individual on foot, moving with tactical awareness." Wilson immediately drew his sidearm, positioning himself with line of sight to the cabin's front entrance. "Bennett's people." Margaret studied the thermal image on her security display. "Unlikely. This is a single operator, no visible support team. Bennett would deploy at least a 4-person tactical element for a capture operation." "Reynolds," Sarah suggested. "The rendezvous coordinates we sent him weren't far from here." "Or a scout for a larger force," Wilson countered. "We can't afford assumptions at this point." Margaret activated an external speaker system. "Unidentified individual approaching from the northwest. You have entered a secured area. Identify yourself immediately." Through the security feed, they watched as the figure stopped, then deliberately raised both hands to show they were empty. "Commander Jack Reynolds, United States Navy," came the clear response. "I'm alone and unarmed. Sarah Miller sent me coordinates for rendezvous." Margaret looked to Sarah questioningly. Sarah nodded, though not without reservation. "Let him approach, but maintain security protocols until we can verify his intentions." As Reynolds was guided through the security perimeter by Margaret's instructions, Sarah couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Someone had compromised her grandfather's carefully constructed security measures. Someone had given Bennett information that only a trusted insider would possess. The question that burned in her mind as they prepared to retrieve the Redwood documentation was a chilling one. Was Jack Reynolds truly an ally in their fight against corruption, or the final piece in Bennett's plan to eliminate the last evidence of his decades-long betrayal? Margaret's cabin had transformed into an impromptu operations center. Maps, satellite imagery, and facility schematics covered every available surface. As the 4 of them, Sarah, Wilson, Reynolds, and Margaret, finalized their approach to the Redwood documentation site. Reynolds, having been thoroughly questioned about his escape from Bennett's forces and his journey to the rendezvous point, had gradually earned a tentative acceptance from Wilson and Margaret. His tactical insights and obvious determination to expose Bennett's corruption had helped overcome their initial suspicion. "The primary challenge is the underground access," Reynolds observed, studying the facility schematics Margaret had retrieved from her extensive files. "Even if Sarah can neutralize the external security elements, the vault itself will have additional protections." "James would have implemented a dual authentication system," Wilson noted, "something requiring both physical keys and knowledge-based verification." As Sarah examined the custom rifle her grandfather had left in Margaret's care, a modified M24 with advanced optics and noise suppression capabilities. The weapon felt like an extension of her own body as she conducted function checks and familiarized herself with its specific characteristics. "My grandfather took me to this region multiple times when I was younger," she recalled, looking up from the weapon. "Always the same time of year, always following the same routes. I thought it was just his preference for routine, but now—" "He was showing you the way," Margaret confirmed. "Insurance that if something happened to him, you could find the location again." "Did he ever take you inside the facility?" Wilson asked. Sarah searched her memories, trying to recall details that might have seemed insignificant at the time. "No, not inside, but there was a specific overlook he always insisted we hike to. He called it his thinking spot. Said the view helped put things in perspective." She moved to the topographical map, identifying the location from memory. "Here, this ridge has direct line of sight to the facility approximately 900 yards from the main structure." Wilson studied the position with a tactician's eye. Excellent overwatch location. Clear fields of fire to all external security positions. He glanced at Sarah. A perfect sniper's nest for someone with your capabilities. That's our insertion point, Reynolds decided. Sarah establishes overwatch from the ridge, while Wilson and I approach from the eastern ravine. Margaret coordinates communications and monitors for additional Bennett assets entering the area. The security personnel at the facility aren't just rent-a-cops, Wilson cautioned. They're likely former special operations, possibly from the same units Bennett has been influencing for years. They'll be equipped with night vision, thermal imaging, and tactical communications. Which is why we need a diversion, Reynolds replied. Something to draw attention and resources away from our actual approach vector. Margaret had been quietly working at one of her computer terminals during this discussion. Now she looked up, a grim satisfaction in her expression. I believe I can provide that diversion. Bennett's operation is extensive, but not without vulnerabilities. One of those vulnerabilities is their dependence on centralized communications protocols. She turned her screen to show them a complex network diagram. This is the encrypted communication architecture Bennett is using to coordinate his containment operation. All field teams report through this network, receiving updates and instructions from Central Command. You can compromise it, Reynolds asked, clearly impressed. Not directly, Margaret admitted. But I can inject false intelligence, specifically a high-confidence report placing Sarah and Wilson approximately 30 miles northwest of the actual Redwood location. Wilson nodded appreciatively. Bennett would have to divert significant resources to investigate. Creating our window of opportunity, Reynolds concluded. As the final elements of their plan took shape, Sarah found her thoughts returning to her grandfather, the man who had foreseen this moment years before it arrived, who had prepared her with every skill she would need to complete his mission. The responsibility was enormous, but for the first time since discovering the journal, she felt equal to the challenge. We move at 200, Reynolds announced, checking his watch. That gives us 3 hours to prepare equipment and review approach routes. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression resolute. What we're doing goes against everything I was trained to believe about chain of command and institutional integrity. But sometimes loyalty to principles has to supersede loyalty to individuals or organizations. My grandfather would have agreed with that sentiment, Sarah replied quietly. He believed that true patriotism sometimes requires standing against those who betray the ideals they claim to protect. As they separated to make final preparations, Sarah took a moment to examine her grandfather's journal one last time. Beyond the operational details and evidence documentation, she found a personal message written on the final page, words clearly intended for her eyes should the journal ever reach her. Sarah, if you're reading this, then the burden I never wanted you to carry has fallen to you nonetheless. I trained you not just to protect yourself, but to protect the truth when I no longer could. Remember that the strength I helped you develop isn't measured in accuracy or tactical proficiency, but in the courage to stand for what's right when standing is hardest. The skills are just tools. Your integrity is the weapon that matters most. Whatever happens, know that I am prouder of you than anything else in my life. The little ghost who could move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf has become a woman strong enough to face storms that have broken many good people before her. Complete this mission, if you can, but never at the cost of the principles it's meant to defend. Some prices are too high, even for justice. All my love. Grandpa Sarah closed the journal, a newfound resolve settling over her. In less than 3 hours, they would attempt to recover the documentation her grandfather had protected with his life evidence that could expose decades of corruption at the highest levels of American intelligence. Whatever awaited them at the Redwood facility, success or failure, revelation or ambush, Sarah was determined to honor the legacy of the man who had prepared her for this moment, whether she had realized it or not. The Invisible Woman was about to step fully into the light carrying truth, as her weapon against those who had thrived in darkness for far too long. In the end, Sarah Miller discovered that invisibility was never about being unseen. It was about choosing the right moment to be visible. Her grandfather had prepared her for a battle he hoped would never come, teaching her to disappear into backgrounds while honing the skills that would one day bring truth into the light. Some would call it a burden, this inheritance of secrets and purpose. But as Sarah stood on that ridge overlooking the facility, her grandfather's rifle steady in her hands, she understood it was also a gift, the chance to honor a legacy of principle in a world that too often sacrifices right for expedient. The costs were high. A career abandoned. A quiet life shattered. Safety and anonymity exchanged for danger and exposure. Yet some prices must be paid when the alternative is allowing shadows to govern what belongs in daylight. Perhaps that's the true measure of character, not the battles we choose when glory awaits, but the stands we take when standing means standing alone. What shadows in your own life might be worth illuminating, no matter the cost?